Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Usually I have someone come up here first to say welcome, but here I am. Welcome. My name is Debbie Eisen. I'm Anishinaabe Kwe, originally from Batchewana First Nations by Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. I am a 36-year veteran of the Canadian Forces, retired in December of 2011, and that's what brought me here to Mi'kmaq Territory. I have the distinct honor of providing you with opening prayer this morning for your gathering. But before I do that, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and I thank them for allowing us to be here to gather and celebrate today. Ani buju nanatemakus, Indeshnakas nomea gunaway, Anishinaabe Kwe, Batchewana. Creator, give us hearts to understand, never to take from creation's beauty more than we can give, never to destroy wantonly for the furtherance of greed, never to deny to give our hands for the building of earth's beauty, never to take from her what we cannot use. Give us hearts to understand that to destroy earth's music is to create confusion, that to wreck her appearance is to blind us to her beauty, that to callously pollute her fragrance is to make a house of stench, that we care for her as she will care for us. We have forgotten who we are. We have sought only for our own security. We have exploited simply for our own ends. We have distorted our knowledge, and we have abused our power. Creator, whose dry lands thirst, help us to find a way to refresh your lands. Creator, whose waters are choked with debris and pollution, help us to find the way to cleanse your waters. And Creator, for those men and women who are sick and need your help and strength and guidance in the days ahead, we pray that you be with them and guide them on their path to good health and to happiness. And for our loved ones who are preparing themselves for their final journey to you, or who have begun their final journey to you, we pray, Creator, that you guide them and greet them and give them strength and bravery so that they will not be afraid. And I pray, Creator, that you come into this gathering today to help these men and women who are here to help our people and to help those with sustainability. Help them to open their minds and their hearts to their work that is before them. And for those men and women who work tirelessly day in and day out, protecting our way of life here in Kjipuktuk, I pray that you keep them safe and free from harm until their duties are complete. And lastly, Creator, for those veterans, those men and women who are far from home, protecting our way of life here on Turtle Island, keep them safe until their tour of duty is complete and they return back to Turtle Island and back to the loving arms of their family and their friends. Taho miigwech aha. Thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you have an awesome couple of days. And I look forward to hearing the outcome of your gatherings. Miigwech walalan.
Good morning. My name is Tara Wickwire, and I'm here with fellow members of the organizing committee, Jennifer Angel, TJ McGuire, Paul McKinnon, and Kurash Rod. We've gathered a room full of experts, some of the most innovative, interesting minds in the field of planning, placemaking, design, and engineering. We are eager to hear what they have to say and the insights they can offer from their communities to ours. The idea behind this year's theme, Moving People, has been to bring inspiration into our day-to-day work and talk about all aspects of mobility, accessibility, placemaking, and smart cities. But moving people may mean something entirely different to some other people, and that's displacement. Moving people from their homes and neighborhoods with the excuse of giving them better lives. There's a video documentary called Remembering Africville, and I'd like to share a quick clip from that video. That is not the video. But that was a good plug for them. Brought to you by...
How much did they pay for that?
That's right. And we're live.
Our homes. They moved us out of Africville. The city moved us out of... They took our homes. They moved us out of Africville. The city moved us out of Africville in the city garbage trucks to ask them to give us our storage out there. They said they couldn't do it. There was too many railroad tracks. There were too many rocks. They couldn't give us our water. They're going to put water in Africville. They're going to put it in there because they're going to have to use it for an industrial site, which that means they're going to have water. Yeah. So why not give us the water? Why on welfare? I think a whole lot of us, when we came in this city, we had to go on welfare. When we lived in that city of Africville, you look in the records and see how many Africville people had to humble and come to the city for welfare. We were too independent. We didn't want it. We earned our own living, and we earned it the honest way. Our boys never had so much trouble until they came in the city.
Were you taxpayers in Africa?
Oh, yes, we were.
You paid taxes on the land and the property.
That's right.
And now you've lost land
We have lost land, property, everything. That's right. And I think 3/4 of the people from Africville, they are on welfare. I am quite positive sure, which we never had it.
Africville is just one of many examples where planning has taken a dark turn in our city. We also have the Cogswell Interchange, which displaced many other vulnerable Haligonians and severed the north end from our downtown, leading to decades of deterioration and neglect that the community is still recovering from today. And then there's our colonial past that essentially tried to erase Indigenous culture and people from our city by civilizing them. The sobering reminder through all of this is that each one of those examples were propagated by so-called experts, innovators of their time. people that thought they were doing the right thing. But we are now working to repair those decisions. The reason we say all that, well, for the planners, designers, decision makers, and anyone who has any sort of power in this room, it's because we want you to be inspired by the stories you're going to hear today, but also be accountable. The decisions we make today are going to impact the world for us and for our grandchildren's grandchildren, for better or for the worse. With that in mind, we need to learn how to better decentralize power and let others advocate and even decide for themselves how they want to see their communities change and evolve, even if that feels uncomfortable for the experts. To me, that speaks to the heart of this conference for all of us. We started this event 3 years ago to make city building knowledge and ideas accessible to the broader public because we want planning to come from the ground up, from the community, and it's why this event is free. It's why we evolve it year over year to best fit the needs of our community first. We've invited these speakers from around the world to our maritime city not because we want to tell you what is right and wrong, but because we want to get the conversation started. So if you feel like you aren't an expert, you don't know what a placemaking or you don't know what mobility is or how they relate, you could feel out of the loop. Good. We want you here, we need you here, and so with that, welcome to Art of City Building 2019, Moving People. We're so glad you're here. And now I'll introduce our Mayor, Mike Savage, to say a few words.
Good morning. Goy. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to the conference. I love the way that Tara set this up. This is how I interpreted what you said. Some of the most imaginative, creative, and inspiring minds, plus the mayor. Is that sort of what I heard? First of all, I want to acknowledge, as Debbie, our elder, did, that we're on the traditional and the unceded, the unsurrendered land of the Mi'kmaq people. We who live here are all beneficiaries of the peace and friendship treaties that happened a long time ago for some of us, but just recent history compared to the Mi'kmaq who've made this place their home for more than 13,000 years. And those of you who are new, who haven't been to, how many people have not been to Halifax before? We've got some of our guests. I encourage you just to walk down that way a bit, and you'll see why the Mi'kmaq referred to this land as Jabuktuk, which meant the Great Harbor. So welcome. I also want to acknowledge my colleagues from council who are here. Councillor Way Mason, who is the district councillor for the South End, which is District 7, and has been dealing with Hurricane Dorian and dealing with it very effectively over the last week. Thank you for that. And also, I think Councillor Matt Whitman, Matt Whitman from District 13 is here as well. I don't want to acknowledge everybody. I look around the room, I see Frank Palermo and Kelsey and people who are making this city so much more livable. The only other person I'll acknowledge before I introduce Mary is my sister Sheila. So Sheila is, Sheila, that doesn't mean a lot to some of you yet. Sheila's been working around the world for the last number of years. She's older than I am, by quite a bit. And so she's been working in international development the last few years at the Coady Institute. She's now a resident of Halifax and is making a mark, and the rumor is she's going to run for mayor in 2020. So I wish you the very best on that. Sheila, nice to have you with us. You know what, this is an incredible conference with such wonderful speakers, and it's free. Why? Because so many people, whether individually or collectively, have stepped up to make it happen. I think that this city has that effect on people. We love our city, and we're invested in helping it reach its vast potential. So thank you to the organizers. I want to thank Tara, I want to thank Karash, Jen, TJ, Paul, for the work that they've done, and everybody who's made this successful event that it already is, I understand, from the people who were walking around the city yesterday. Thank you to the sponsors who've stepped up to make this happen. And really thank you to the guest speakers, a couple of whom I heard this morning on Information Morning, and made me proud of our city as it is, but hopeful for our city as it could be. I know the theme of this year is moving people, which sounds far simpler than it probably is. In this period of unprecedented population growth and development intensification in our city, moving people effectively in ways that benefit community livability and the environment is more urgent than ever. We're learning the lessons, probably slower than we should, that our streets belong first of all to people. When we make it easier for people to walk or cycle, they choose to do so. Through our new plan for transit, we're building a more efficient, logical system rather than perpetuating routes that were politically driven. We all have to work through these challenges and opportunities together. In our city, we have things like the Integrated Mobility Plan, the Center Plan, the Green Network Plan, our Cogswell Interchange Plan. There's a lot of things that are on the go. And I think it was either one of the speakers who was on CBC this morning said they actually had a look at our Commons Plan. And so there's a lot of plans. But as a city, we've always had plans. We just haven't implemented them all that well. And now I hope that we are. I also have the distinct pleasure this morning of introducing your first speaker, Mary Rowe. How many of you know Mary, by the way? Okay. The new president and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute. But Mary's been a passionate advocate for livable and resilient cities for decades. She also happens to be a great friend of my sister, Sheila, and I know the pair had a few adventures together over the past few days. Mary came by to see me on Friday, and we talked about the coming federal election, and she said the words that are magic to the ears of big city mayors and all mayors across Canada. City building is nation building. And you said it again this morning. I know this is not the place for a political pitch, but in a room full of people so earnestly engaged in the job of building better cities, I hope you see this election as an opportunity to ask tough questions about candidates' views of the roles of Canadian cities. And I'll put a plug in for a debate that is a week from today, Monday night is it at Neptune? At Neptune, Paul McKinnon, downtown Halifax and downtown Dartmouth Business Commissions will be inviting all the federal candidates to come and talk about building better cities. Now, Mary knows of what she speaks. She's led local, national, and international urban initiatives in Toronto, New York City, including the initial redevelopment of reimagining the Civic Commons designed to strengthen social cohesion and build resilience. Her work focused on community centers, parks, libraries, and third spaces, very much how we see this wonderful central library. By the way, if you haven't been in this library, this is one of the top 15 libraries in the Halifax Regional Municipality. We got a lot of good ones. This is pretty special. In addition to her role with the Canadian Urban Institute, Mary is a senior fellow with Evergreen and Future Cities Canada. A couple of months ago, I was at a conference in Vancouver with some other mayors and some urban planners and housing experts and a number of others. Mary was the facilitator. If you ever want a facilitator who's one tough son of a bitch and keeps things going ruthlessly but effectively with a sense of humor, but also with a directness that you come to appreciate when it's directed at somebody else, Mary is awesome. So it's my great pleasure to hand the floor over to Mary Rowe, who I think is our first speaker of the day. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have a wonderful time here, and we certainly at the city look forward to seeing what comes out of it. Thank you all. Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Mary Rowe.
Well, good morning, everybody. What a nice introduction. I've known the Savage family for 40 years. Sheila and I were undergraduates together at the University of Toronto 4 decades ago. And she is recently back to Halifax, which is tremendous, and she's got international experience all over the place. And what a fantastic family the Savage family is in terms of demonstrating what it's like to commit your life to public good and to civic life. And I'm happy to have been here for 3 or 4 days and tootled around. So, I advance my own slides, and do I just press the green button and it advances? Okay, so I'm going to be really fast. If you were with me last night, you saw that I talk fast and I always have too many slides. But I have to leave, unfortunately. I have to give my talk and then run because I have a memorial service that I need to attend in Ontario. So I'm sorry about that, because really what I would like to do is be here and learn and engage with you and get a sense of what's really happening in Halifax and how you can benefit from what you're being stimulated to think about, but by the folks like me that are coming in. But I'm going to just whiz through these and just try to give you some top-line stuff. This is Morgan Grove, and what he's saying, he's a bioregional ecologist, but what he's saying is that cities are what really matters, ultimately, to make change happen globally, which is why city building is nation building. It's also addressing global challenges, and cities are aware these things are being fostered. One of our speakers last night talked about being a ruralist, and we have to find a way to be an urbanist and a ruralist in our lives. We've got to find a way to stitch this narrative together. And what's so interesting about Halifax is that the municipality is so big and it has a diverse set of uses that you may be actually on the vanguard of this, about how do we stitch this narrative together. When I was in New York, we used this. I worked at MAS, oldest civic organization in North America, looking at the relationship between the built form and how a city functions. And we used this as a way to kind of shape our work. But you'll see at the bottom, livability and resilience were the things that underpinned urban life. And what we say with that is that livability is how you and I experience the city day to day right now. Resilience is how do we actually adapt to constant change. So we have to live in the here and now, but we have to be thinking about the future all at the same time. And if we don't start to come to terms with significant challenges that exist in cities. This morning on the radio, because I'm a polite Canadian, I wasn't about to start ringing the bells saying, holy shit, Haligonians, you got to start paying attention to this, this, and this. That's important for you to be doing that work. But there are particular challenges, obviously, that we face nationally that are resonant here. This is not an up-to-date slide, and I know there are people that are going to tell me that immigration number is not reflective of what's really happening. But we are a receiving country of newcomers. We've been built by newcomers, and we will continue to be, and our cities need to find ways to integrate and be able to embrace that. And here's the implication of this rural-urban divide that I'm speaking of. You see where the Democrats are and you see where the Republicans are. We're not much different in Canada in terms of how the rural and urban divide manifests politically. And we've got to try to find a way to create a joint narrative that stitches together rural and urban, semi-urban, peri-urban. And cities have to be the ones to embrace that conversation and get rid of this kind of polarization that lamentably politicians play off of. Here it is in Britain. I mean, this is pretty stark. You can see it if you're in the UK. You can see Brexit is motivated by a whole bunch of different factors. It's very complicated, but it still has a rural-urban flavor to it. This is really a pressing thing, and I think placemaking is one of the ways we can actually create a narrative between rural and urban, because it's all about the local, whether you're in a small community or in a large metropolis. In a large city, neighborhoods struggle to maintain their identity as well, and they need local solutions, hyper-local, even in a large metropolitan area, the same way a smaller community, a rural community, needs to do the same thing. So this is a common conversation where I feel we can start to make common cause. Because fundamentally, cities are about people. This is my butcher in New York City. This is how we air conditioned in my neighborhood in New York. They opened the hydrants. That's literally on my street. All these kinds of things that you see. This is on the bottom right is a binner in Vancouver, who's part of the ecosystem of how recycling works in Vancouver. That's how he makes his livelihood. He goes behind the buildings, and in fact, people don't put their recycling in the municipal system. Many people set it aside so binners can earn a livelihood. When I was in New York, we had Hurricane Sandy come, and what we found was to really mobilize a resilience conversation and action in New York, we had to move everybody into that space. And MAS had been historically an arts organization, and it became a much broader affiliation, as you can see, through the post-Sandy period. So marrying these things, people and place, and we have assets in both, right? We are people, we're communities of people, and then resilience is about marrying the resilience of us with the resilience of our landscape, of which you have a lot, and you've just spent a whole week viscerally experiencing that. I showed this slide last night because to me it's the underpinning of urban life. Resilience is basically underwritten by self-organization. The top of the graph, all of us doing our own thing fairly autonomously. The more connected we are, if you're moving people in every way, you want to be moving them down that chart so that we are interconnected, spatially, physically, culturally, all the different ways we do. And in fact, this is really a natural pattern. And once you see it, you can't not see it. This is how nature works. It gets denser and denser. The weaves get denser and denser. This is from the AGO, and I clipped it the other day because I just love this phrase. Before the creation of the railroad, nature did not throb. It was a sleeping beauty. The railroad animated everything, mobilized everything. The sky became an active infinity, nature and energized beauty. This is what our connectivity needs to do. It needs to stitch us together in the way in which the railroad once did. We have different forms of that stitching, including the internet now. And you can see this manifesting. This is a BRT map. I love BRT because it's flexible. You can change depending on how people use it. It's not as fixed as subways. I tend to be an advocate for things like this. But when we screw up, when we fail to make these connections like this, then communities are at risk. This is a sign to the bridge to what is called the Lower Nine in New Orleans. I was there, and people could not get off the Lower Nine when Hurricane Katrina came because some charming transportation engineer decided this was a good idea to make a bridge not accessible to pedestrians, and it put thousands of people at risk. And the reason the bridge had been put in place in the first place was because of industrial canals like this that were fostered by the oil and gas industry, who basically, if you've ever flown over Louisiana, you know what I'm talking about, is completely broken up now by channels that were created like this that disrupted the natural ecosystem and the natural wetlands capacity to absorb storm surge, and we got this. These are mistakes that we've made. We need to not make them again. In New Orleans post-Katrina, I had this rare opportunity to watch how would self-organization happen when you take 180,000 units and obliterate them in 4 days. And what I saw was that communities started to self-organize in these patterns. They started to form support networks amongst each other to try to just piece through what was going on. There were a network of community centers called Beacons of Hope that were on people's front porches, just like this. And then the longer relationships, once you got your own neighborhood back, then you realized, oh, well, I better start to relate to the neighborhood next to me or the neighborhood across the city. And so we had to form different forms of these long links. That's a simple graph that I have stuck in my mind for 15 years. Hubs and links, that's what cities are. And in post-Sandy, everywhere I go, a storm comes. Toronto's not happy about this, but I lived in New Orleans, Katrina, then I lived in New York, Sandy, and I wasn't here in Halifax when you had Dorian, but there we are. But these kinds of patterns continue to develop, where you see people self-organizing and providing the resources. And we tried to concretize that in New York, and the mayor mentioned this, the Civic Commons, and we tried to look at, well, what are the ways that we as planners and city builders could enable that kind of self-organization to take place? And one of the ways is to invest in those shared spaces, like your common. Because the Civic Commons allows us to do together what we can't do alone. In fact, the city is a commons, fundamentally. That's why we formed them millennia ago. This is an example of where a city has taken a particular action to try to stitch together new connectivity. This is in Medellin, Colombia. Has anybody been there? You've been there. Anybody else been there? Have you been on these? Did you go on the, yeah. So this is a fantastic skyway that allows you to connect with other parts. It brought low-income parts of the city together with where the commercial life was. People were seriously isolated, and so they created these gondolas, which are tremendous. And I really want Canada and Canadian cities to do one. What about Halifax? Maybe you guys should do a gondola. I'm trying to convince Toronto to do one. And what do they put at the stations? How smart is this? You go to get on that gondola, and there's a little lending library there in the station, so you can take a book and go into the gondola, and up you go. They also have these fabulous escalators. I was highly skeptical about these until I went to them. These are the escalators in Comuna 13. There are banks of them, and at the top, local artists have beautified it. Also, there are little businesses at the top. When you get off one escalator, there'll be somebody there selling cell phone minutes. It's like the early version of transit-oriented development, right there at the landing. And beautiful. And then that's what it looks like. And when I was on it, I've got to just tell you, they have Muzak piping out. And when I was on it, they were playing Frank Sinatra's My Way. I'm not quite sure what the significance of that was, but that's the tune that was playing. And then at the top, this is what people have done with their homes. So what happened was, because all of a sudden these neighborhoods were actually connected and people were getting in and out of them, kids were going to school, people were working, the community said, well, we'd like to fix up our houses. And so the city said, well, we'll buy the paint, off you go, knock yourselves out. Well, that's what they've done. So a couple of sort of key things I want to emphasize here. This is about resilience, and as the mayor suggested, and you've got to find different ways to do that. And you've got to work with the personality and the inherent DNA that builds it. There's got to always be a blend here of top-down and bottom-up. There's a big narrative about this. We could all yell at each other about it. It needs to be a blend. It absolutely needs to be a blend. And I think one of the ways that you secure the bottom is by radically decentralizing and democratizing. That's not a popular notion, but you need to, and we in Canada, particularly in our constitutional system, need to find ways to resource and empower cities, because you're the ones that actually know what's really going on and what needs to be fixed. I like this slide. Other people don't. This is the problem with ultimate top-down, if you have it, if it's too autocratic, right? So it's got to be the blend, and I proudly say no more Big Daddy. I can also genderize that to no more Big Mama. And even David Brooks agrees with me. Now listen, when David Brooks agrees with you, you have to feel, okay, all right, that guy is saying it's okay. He's saying, look, spend time listening to the locals. This is why us as experts, part of us, you just think, please, for God's sake, you're the experts, we're not. We're going to come and help you, hopefully, hear yourselves. That's what our job should be, is to enable you to hear yourselves. If you want to get some really good academic cred on this, read 2 of these books by William Easterly. He worked primarily in the developing world. Many of you will know his work. And he basically says 2 kinds of ways of approaching this. Searchers and planners. We need to be searchers. This is a pretty commonly understood thing, not as well implemented as it could be. Artists aren't just about making art. They're not just about making neighborhoods pretty. They actually see the world in a particular kind of way, and their expertise and their perspective is useful as a problem solving, as obviously as beautification, obviously as enlivening. We saw the murals talked about last night, which are fantastic. You've got lots of examples of this. We all know this, right? If you've got a neighborhood or a street that's kind of not going anywhere, you just make that space available to artists, and it'll start going somewhere. This is another adage. It's hard for Canadians. Not everybody wants to swallow this one, but it's true that livability really should begin outside. And other speakers are going to follow me and are going to talk about that. You'll notice I'm taking license here because I have to leave, and the organizer said, don't worry, Mary, you can pretty much cover whatever you want. So I'm not just talking about mobility. I'm talking about the general principles, because the key thing is you don't want to look at anything in isolation. We have no time and no room for single interventions anymore. You're not just going to build a road. You're going to build some kind of a pathway that also has a livability benefit, a resilience benefit. It's going to have some social cohesion. And this kind of outdoor investment is critical to making sure that you have a system that actually works. Those are the founders of the High Line up there, just 2 guys. They're famous now, but they were just before this, they were just 2 guys. And they came up with a notion, and then they got a bunch of partners and a bunch of private capital. It's not the model that anybody wants to replicate. It's the most expensive linear park in the world, and you don't want to do it. But it is instructive for us in terms of understanding how a city was able to make room for 2 guys to come up with an idea and say, hey, just like those 2 guys that did the mural project. And we have to find them, where are those guys and gals, and find ways to empower them so they can take a stab at something and try something. And it's really us organizing each other. It's people organizing people. These are just 3 examples of 4 examples, actually, of folks that have done stuff. Park people started as 1 guy. He came into my office looking for money. I remember it. Now he's got a movement of folks doing parks around the world. The Fresh Ideas for Social Housing, 1 woman who we were in co-op with, Sheila and I lived in the same house with her, said, I'm going to spend some of my extra time thinking about new approaches to social housing. Steve Monroe, he's a tireless, I'm sure the mayor, if he had a Steve Monroe, he'd say he's a pain in the arse kind of guy. He's a transit advocate. He's a citizen. He knows more about transit than any expert ever is going to. And then the bottom meetups, because I'm old, I show old tech examples, and I know there are contemporary ones, but meetups is a phenomenal platform for bringing people together. It's old tech, new tech, old tech, but it allows people to gather and self-organize. These are critical tools. And all the ways in which, and one of the things I tried to say, did I say it this morning? I hope I did, on the radio, is that mid-sized cities have opportunities to try stuff that bigger cities don't. The risks are much higher, the decision-making is labyrinthian, and it's very complicated. Whereas a city your size, I know it's not easy, but a city your size can try some stuff. And these kinds of workarounds, flexible approaches, you're going to hear more about this from my colleagues, about particularly around mobility and how we actually are trying some stuff. And some of the great stuff comes out of the Global South, but they can't be the only ones trying stuff. We can be trying stuff too. We can be resourceful at various scales. I just had to put this in. This is this fabulous shot in Vancouver. Andrew, are you here? Where's Andrew Pask? Do you know where this is? I think it's outside one of the hotels. Yeah, it's at the Fairmont, right? And it goes around. That's a video, but I don't know how to make it work. And the bikes go around. It just made me laugh. And I thought that it's so much more important for its symbolic value, not just that you want to get a bike. This is in Bandung, Indonesia. Indonesia has a phenomenal percentage of its population below 40. And the young folks there were quite intimidated by the natural landscape that was embedded in the city. They didn't like forests, or it was unsafe. So these kids said, fine, we're going to take over this forest. We're going to start to create dinner parties. And so they build this farm, and they have these dinners in the forest, which is recreating a connection between the natural environment and the built environment, allowing people to go into spaces that weren't safe, and they've done it themselves. And fortunately, the city officials said, knock yourself out, give it a try. This is the Art Hive movement. This is in Quebec. There are others, again, creating a kind of civic sharing space. These can take various forms. They can be commercial, they can be private, they can be public. This is one in Paris. This is an old coffin factory. I'm aware of the time, so nobody has to wave at me. I can see I've got a minute and a half left. This is a great facility. It's in a really, really tough neighborhood in Paris. As I said, it was a coffin factory, and so kids started to use it. They refurbished it, and as you can see, people come and do their own thing. The blackboards are an art installation. And I was standing talking with the director, and he said, yeah, that's the art installation, and their television's up top. And he said, and the kids just come and do their thing in front of them and around them. And I said, well, that's interesting. How does that work with the artists? And he said, well, we explained to these kids, neighborhood kids, look, this is an art installation, so don't be going and marking on the blackboards, and don't disrupt it, but just do your thing around. And the kids said, oh, okay, fine. And they start to do their thing. And within 40 minutes, new kids would come in, and the existing kids would go and say, don't touch the art, that's an art installation. It's just part of what we're doing here. It just completely coexisted in a beautiful way, and they were allowed to give the space to do it. This is from the Hudson River in Manhattan, which we did a lot of work on after Sandy, and what we learned was, this is the Ace Hotel lobby, which has become a co-working space. I just shoot these pictures because I want to emphasize, that's actually the Skyline. That's actually the Center for Social Innovation in New York, which was born in Toronto and has an outlet in New York. I just want to say that that's what we're in the business of, is enabling, accommodating, and provoking. Those are my little watchwords. This is another one. Perfect is the enemy of the good. Do not get, I went on a little rant last night about city building and the art of city building, and that cities are not pieces of art. There's nothing perfect about this. Nothing. Right? We're trying to figure out what works and what works well, and we want to constantly tweak and improve and determine what's right, but do not hesitate because you think you haven't got it perfect yet. Do you like this one, Mike? I can say this, you can't. We have to invest. We have to be willing to invest. Oliver Wendell Holmes, I pay my taxes, it buys me civilization. We've got to be committed to understanding what it takes to create community amongst us. That means we have to invest. And I think this is my last slide. This works in New York. It may not work in Canadian audiences. I haven't tried it yet. This is me, obviously, in my apartment. Somebody gave me this T-shirt. It's hard to see because of the way of the angle, but it's more Jane Jacobs, less Marc Jacobs. Let's remember that listen, I love Marc Jacobs, but you don't want him on every corner, which is what's happened in Greenwich Village. We want to maintain our fidelity to the fact that cities are fundamentally about people, moving people, grounding people in place. Thanks very much.
I know you have to go, but you can't get off that quick. We have a few questions for you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Pam Cooley, and I'm the co-founder of CarShare Atlantic. Happy to be here to moderate this morning's session with Kelsey Lane. So I have one question for you, and then I'm going to go to the audience for one question, okay? So if somebody wants to think of something for Mary. So we heard you talk about resilience, and I heard also that risk-taking is very prominent in that. So tell me how you can, the relationship between risk-taking and resilience, and those of us who, and the message for those of us who are trying to do new things and change, but we come across a lot of resistance.
Sure.
So what's the message to us those of us who are trying to change things or do things new, and the message to the city folks who we're trying to change with or get permission from or whatever? So just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm in a new job, 4 days in, leading something called the Canadian Urban Institute. And what I said last night is I hope I can come back a year from now, once I've been across the country enough and really listened well to what's going on in urban Canada, that I'll be able to tell more stories about what is working in Canada and Canadian cities and where are cities taking risks and learning. Because ideally what you want, obviously risk is that we all minimize risk in our lives. And part of the challenge then is, and I think one of the mistakes that we've had in city building historically, is that an idea cottoned on, and then all of a sudden, oh, we're all going to build big towers and for public housing, and before you know it, it's in every city that we have this form, which we've now seen doesn't work, towers, isolated, no life on the street. And so you don't want to make those mistakes again. You know, that's the big daddy resistance that I've got, big grand plans. There really aren't, I don't think, I mean, there will be others that will follow me and say differently, but I don't think that there are that many grand solutions. There are large ideas that can percolate and proliferate and manifest in different ways. And in fact, you want them to look different. One of the concerns I had last night that I raised was you don't want your harborfront to look like everybody else's harborfront. And that's always the challenge, is that all of a sudden, because designers and designs, it's like haircuts. You know, I used to live in a small town, and I would think, how do I make sure that my haircut is current with everybody else's haircut? And, you know, we want to have a whole bunch of different kinds of haircuts, right? And ones that where, as Tim said on the radio, you know, you want to know this is Halifax. So in terms of how do you mediate risk, it has become more popular in other urban environments where we call them pilots now. And pilots are a way, so for instance, in Toronto, they've done something with King Street. I'm sure Jennifer Keesman, when she was here in the previous one of the previous conferences, would have talked about it. And to suggest that you're going to take cars off a main thoroughfare is a big, hairy, scary idea if you just say blanket, we're taking them off. But if you take a limited area, because you want to be able to course correct. Part of self-organization is you're constantly course correcting. You're walking on the street, you choose a route. One of the best things about a grid, that road's too busy, I don't want to deal with that, I'm not going to walk there, I'm going to walk here. You constantly course correct. So what I would suggest is that you try to find ways to find an area where you can exercise a pilot really well. The key then is, can you course correct? Can you be nimble enough to adjust if it's not working? And similarly, if it is working, how do you then share that with other communities to say, we've tried it, here's how it works. And that's part of what I'm going to try to do at CUI, is see how do we create platforms for learning so that if something is working really well in Saskatoon, you can hear about it in Halifax and vice versa. You know, one anecdote about this, just you asked me and I'm giving you an answer, and then I'm leaving, is years ago, Adam Vaughan, who's now a federal member, was a TV reporter, and he talked about he was in a neighborhood that he was working in Toronto, or he was covering, and it was a residential neighborhood, and they were asking for speed bumps. Could I have speed bumps? We need speed bumps. We got kids. Couldn't get the city to respond, giving them speed bumps. So the neighborhood kind of got together and said, here's what we do. Everybody move your parking on the street. People were parking on the street. Everybody at night, park your car 18 inches away from the curb, both sides of the street. So they all started doing that. They started parking their cars 18 inches inside the street, away from the curb. Well, then, you know what? The street was pretty narrow. People stopped speeding pretty quickly. So there are these kinds of little workarounds, you know.
So create your own way to take risks and show what works.
Yeah, and I heard you have to ask for permission. You know, I'm an old ask for forgiveness, not permission girl. But,
yeah.
but
I can tell that.
But that can be risky. That can be risky. So you want to, you know, as I said, you've always got to weigh up what risks there are.
Do we have one question from the audience? Anybody? Okay.
They hated me.
Oh, there
There's
is
one.
one way in the back. Can you stand up and speak? So the question is micromobility in the cities, like scooters, etc.
You know, there's a joke in American cities, I don't know if you've seen it, but people take photographs of abandoned scooters and, you know, alas, per Yorick, you know, another one sort of ditch somewhere. You know, these are early days, right? Early days. And I guess my view on this, there are mobility experts in the room today who will speak more articulately about this. My instinct on this is we have to see how the mix is going to work. Part of my hesitation around planners is that they overestimate how much they know and can predict in the future. And so when we were creating streets, for horses, did we know that eventually they would be home to all the different kinds of mobility challenges? So how are we going to understand what's the next thing beyond the scooter? And whether scooters will stick or not, I don't know. Whether we're going to be able to negotiate those shared spaces, I don't know. There's just so many questions on this, but I would like to think that we are creating nimble responses so that if you find it doesn't work or there are aspects that it doesn't work, that there will be a course correction and that you won't just immediately abandon an option, but actually see if it can be integrated differently. We're all doing it differently, and our children and our grandchildren navigate these things in a whole different way. So that would be one admonition I would have, or one caution I would have, is that as you make these decisions, make sure you're not just talking to people that look like me and are my age. You've got to be talking to really young people who can tell us better whether it works or not works. Yeah.
So final question, in your new role at the Canadian Urban Institute, how can Halifax be a part of, sitting at the table and share their successes and their failures and learn amongst other Canadian cities?
The mayor mentioned a meeting in Vancouver in May, which is something called the Urban Project, which is a partnership with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and Maytree and a bunch of other national partners. And I've been the facilitator there. And I think that part of what we want to do is build horizontal infrastructure in Canada. We're not great on this, We've got a lot of vertical infrastructure in Canada, so you relate to your province and then the province relates to the federal government. And our constitutional system is set up horizontally. But in fact, when you look at healthy urban economies around the world, there are ones where there's tons of horizontal exchange. In the United States, they have more cities, and Philly has as much, Philly and New York talk much more than New York talks to Albany. It's probably not true, but you know what I'm getting at. There's certainly more economic activity. Yeah. And I think that the more we can strengthen horizontal relationships at the city level, and not just at the elected official level, but development community, professionals, community groups, special interest groups, stakeholder groups, because really it's all going to melt down. That's my slides at the beginning. It's all going to melt down to what's happening at the local, and how do we embrace the local and allow that to flourish and for us to learn from one another and be connected. So that's my mandate, is to create that kind of horizontal connective tissue in urban Canada.
Mary Rowe, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mary.
Okay, so next we have Benji De La Peña. So he's Chief of Strategy and Innovation for the City of Seattle and Department of Transportation Seattle. So he's initiated the first ever citywide public lifestyle to measure vibrancy and to understand how people use the right-of-way as public space. Throughout his career, Benji has worked on urban development issues that cover technology, transportation, and informality. His ideas have been featured in City Lab, Atlantic Cities, Next City, Future Everything, and TED City 2.0. So we are thrilled to have Benji here with us today.
They didn't tell me they were putting me after Mary Rowe. So my apologies. Also, I am not a dental hygienist. Let's just be clear about that. And they asked me to come talk about transportation, and I geek out about transportation. So these will be geekier issues than you may be used to. I'm not going to talk about buses, but happy to talk about that offline or after in questions. Okay, so doesn't he? Oh, it's the green one. Okay, how do I back up? I geek out, but I can't control PowerPoint. How do I back up? Is it the... there you go. A system built this. Not one designer. And a system continues to build these things, which is why it's very difficult to resist them. There's a logic to these systems. It's deep into structures. And if we want to make change, we have to change systems. Right? So I'm going to make it easy for you. Here are the takeaways. I'm going to repeat them later, but if you take a picture of this now, you're done. You can leave, and you can come back after about 16 minutes, and then you would have enjoyed Mary Rowe and then just one slide from me. But here it is. If you want to change things, you have to change the system. Information itself is getting built out as an infrastructure. This is hidden from us, but we experience it every day. Tech innovation also requires institutional innovation. That's what we always forget. And then if we want transportation to work and transportation information to work, you have to do two things, and this echoes what Mary was talking about. You have to focus on the users and their needs, and have to build on values that we share. Either, if an imbalance of those will either be too top-down or too bottom-up and lacking direction that works for the public good. Also, I'm going to tell you people you should read from the canon of, outside the canon of urbanists. Again, you can take a picture of this and you're done, and you can then not listen to the rest of it. 4 people, Donella Meadows, wrote a monograph that's still available online, Places to Intervene in a System. Stuart Brand has written many books, but he's famous for the first one to ever ask for, why don't we have a picture of the whole Earth? This was in the 60s after the satellites went up. He's got 2 books. He got many books, but 2 that I would recommend. How Buildings Learn, Clock of the Long Now, which is long-term thinking. James Gleick is what they call an idea biographer. And one of his recent books was more than a decade now, so I don't know if it's recent. The Information, a History, a Theory, and a Flood, and it's how information has shaped our society. And he explains how speaking drums and the science of information are all related. Right? Douglas Allen, Institutional Revolution, and this is the themes that I'm going to be talking about, that as technology changes, institutions have to shift, and that's where the power is. I'm not related to any of them. I do not earn anything from recommending their books, but please do read them. So let's start with Donella Meadows. She listed down 12 places to intervene in the system. She listed them counting down from the ones with the least power to the most power. And the first one is you change the system by changing what you measure. Right? And I will guarantee to you that in any city, and particularly in Halifax, the most measured thing you will have in all of the databases of the city will be how vehicles move. Right? It's vehicle counts daily, hourly, and everything else. So we need to start changing what we measure, as that old management adage goes, what gets measured matters and what gets measured changes. So I'm going to be talking about the power of information to shape systems and perpetuate injustice. So you might think of information that's just Excel on your spreadsheet or something that runs something else, but they can bury and shape injustice, right? They can shape a system and bury injustice. 2 examples, redlining, right, which I know happened also in Canada. Redlining, of course, was shaped by bigoted, racist, cultural, and sociological forces. But it was expressed informationally. It was simply this conclusion without any research that households of color, people of color, were a greater credit risk. Right? So, therefore, don't give them loans. And so, therefore, the agency, the Home Ownership Lending Corporation in the US created the redlining maps that said, here are the communities where there are households of color. There are risky communities or risky neighborhoods. Don't lend to them. And that shaped not just the way we do zip codes, but the way we provided private credit and the way we provided public amenities, and these communities got left behind. Right? Because we just said, informationally, they're not worth the credit, so therefore banks are not going to give and governments are not going to provide resources. And that has shaped US cities, and I bet it has also shaped Canadian cities. Interestingly enough, when we came around with urban renewal and running highways through cities to tear down communities, which parts did we tear down? These areas that had no investments in them, no private or public investments. Because informationally we said, this is what drives it. We think they're a risk. Even if there was no evidence behind it, but it was so buried down. In fact, in the US, your zip code defines your outcomes in life and your outlook in life, both your life expectancy, and you can have as big a gap as 3 years between one zip code to another zip code in the same city, and the zip code is built on redlining. The other one is level of service, which is much more of transportation. And level of service is a simple measure. How many vehicles pass through a segment of street within a given time frame? The assumption behind it is the more vehicles pass through, the better it is for the system, right? So the assumption is where efficiency is more movement. And so you get interchanges because intersections take time, you get wider roads, you get less sidewalks, you get unhealthy cities. Because we said that the measure at the base of it is level of service. So information shapes the system and very often perpetuates injustice. So we have to be very conscious about how information systems are getting built and what they're deciding. So in 2018, we did the first time ever, a Department of Transportation, at least as far as I know, so if someone wants to correct me, in the US did a first time ever citywide public survey, or public life survey, which is we go out and study what exactly are people doing on the street. Are they social? Are they walking alone? Have they gone shopping? We say citywide because we only did 108 blocks of 3,000 or so blocks within the city, but it was the first time ever. And the reason we did that, apart from understanding what people are doing, is these are all the sensors we use in the city of Seattle. And that little number on the middle lower portion of bottom half of the slide is we have 12 sensors for bike and pedestrian counts. The only way we count people is, are they crossing a particular intersection, or how many bikes are passing. Compare that to the 3,000 parking pay meters we have, the 241 cameras, all of the sensors we have to tell us how are vehicles moving. So we need to shift that, and so every time we make decisions, then it is driven by the evidence that is a biased evidence because it's gathering only what 2-ton vehicles are doing. Right? So we need to get the squishy parts into the mixture. And so the other thing that we need to be conscious about too is how information moves and what we react to. This is a slide, a graph I stole from Stuart Brand. He worked with Patrick Duffy, and it's called shearing layers. And the idea is that in any system, there are things that change very rapidly, like fashion in society changes very rapidly. It is weaker and has less power, but it's very evident. And there are things that change very, very slowly, and they're more powerful and they're less visible. So emergencies and incidents, that kind of information changes your travel for a day. It's not going to be permanent. But when you talk about road geometries and regulations, that's very, very powerful. And sometimes it takes forever to decide to spend, the 300 million or the 3 million it might take to take off an intersection so buses can turn. And you spend years on it because it's shaped that already. And deeper down are the system values and goals, governance, basically who's at the table and who gets to decide what's important. So as we think about information and transportation, we have to think about these layers of information and how powerful they are. The further down you go to change things, the more power you can change the system. So might be news to you, someone already mentioned it, that transportation is getting disrupted. Urban transportation is getting disrupted. First it was all this talk about autonomous vehicles, right? Maybe it'll come in 5 years, maybe it'll come in 80 years. And then you've got shared bikes that came. First it was the dock shared bikes about a decade ago, then the dockless shared bikes, and then the electric bikes. Now you've got electric scooters, and then there'll be drones. They're calling them personal delivery devices. I don't know what's personal about them, but they're going to be coming on city streets. So it's changing. And my particular interest is departments of transportation are interested in changes in technology of transportation, the vehicle and the mode. And rightly so, because that's how people move. But that's all driven by changes in how people receive information. The most disruptive thing in transportation is in your pocket and your ability to see a map and to figure out where you're going and to get a ride. Right? So what are we doing in terms of that? And that's all built on this information stack that is in your phone that allows you to see where you are and maybe get on a bus or get on a ride share and whatever else. And that's being built largely by private sector with a lot of information from government, but without a lot of interaction apart from that use, right? So let's go back to Donella Meadows. Places to intervene in a system. 6 is the structure of information flows. Who gets information and what can they use it for? 2 is the goals of the system. 3 is the mindset or paradigm of what is important. And then the power to transcend paradigms. And so what we did was, we're drafting the Transportation Information Infrastructure Plan. Because at the base of all the transportation changes that are happening is this information infrastructure. And we as a Department of Transportation are good with, pardon the pun, concrete. What is concrete? With paint, with signals. We're not yet good in handling information. And that's what we need to plan for. So there's a hidden transportation ecosystem that's emerging. And our question is, what's our role in that? How do we make sure it works for the public good, which is our remit, right? And we start with, basically, we start with saying that information is as important as all the other modes. It's as important as a mode. That's why we need to have a plan for it. And creating this plan creates 2 things. There's an informational challenge. Why? This is two more concepts to throw at you, bound and unbound communication. The thing on the left is a blanket from the Lakota, and it's the tale of 2 summers over a year. It's gorgeous, a gorgeous blanket, it's information rich, but you have to have experienced that to understand what it's saying. The thing on the right is a cuneiform script from the Fertile Crescent, and what it is the beginnings of letters and numbers and language that is then transferable. So the one on the right is unbound because I can reinterpret that and use the same signs. The one on the left is bound. It's very, very rich, but you need to know the experience of it. And pretty much government information is like that. It's bound in databases, in spreadsheets, and whatever else, and it's not very easy to transmit them. The institutional challenge is we need to change from just simply gathering information. The reason governments are called bureaucracies is literally they have bureaus where the rules were put and the records were put. And we're good at collecting information. We're not good in broadcasting information, which is what you need to do to interact with the information system. Another point then that this is a challenge, right? That tech innovation requires institutional innovation because we do not have those capacities. Right? We know, again, concrete stuff. So the question is, how do we do this apart from having a plan? The first thing is what we need to do is to focus on the users and to say what information needs do people have so that they can get around the city, including what kind of protections do they need, right? That they may say, my privacy is an issue. And so we looked and thought about and worked with our community to say, what is the information you actually need to be able to use this emerging transportation system, right? In whatever capacity and abilities you may have. And that's so important that we focus on the user because we tend to focus on vehicles rather than the user experience. Right? And that answers all of the things that, what if I don't have a credit card, right? What if I don't have the same abilities as you? And including the cultural issues that underlie all of these things. The other thing that we need to do is we need to build on values. So focusing on users helps us to focus on the people who actually use it. But as you know, on the internet, there's another book that I didn't list. I will recommend Gia Tolentino wrote a book called Trick Mirror, Adventures in Self-Delusion. Her first essay in that book is The I in Internet. And what she basically says is, and you feel it, right? The business of the internet has been built on focusing on the self. There was a term they used to use about a decade ago when open data was going around, and they said, it's the information exhaust. That's what's important. Or they used to say, and they still do, information is the new oil, which is very apt because information has created existential threats to our society. By knowing what exactly you are doing and where you go and what you're interested in, I can target you and polarize you. Right? And then I can also sell that without you knowing it. So we need to do both. Focus on a user and make sure the public it is protected by focusing on values. Seattle Department of Transportation has 6 values, right? We say equity because we know the transportation system and the investments in it has been instrumental in so much injustice in our cities. Right? And so we need to put that first and make sure we form the Transportation Equity Advisory Council. We're creating transportation equity goals to make sure that whatever we do, we are not just mitigating, but we are trying to correct past injustice. Safety, of course. Far too many people are getting killed on our roads, and that should not be the case. We have to stop calling them accidents. They are collisions, and we need to stop being obsessed with 2-ton vehicles as they are the drivers, forgive the pun, of our transportation networks. Mobility so that you have more transportation options, and we know that has so much to do with the opportunities that you can get to and how goods move in our cities. We value sustainability, and this is me talking and not the agency. Whenever someone brings up why we should have protected bike lanes, I have to ask them whether they believe in the climate crisis or not. If you believe in the climate crisis, you need protected bike lanes, right? Because that's the most sustainable way. Cars, individual, privately owned cars, are just not sustainable. It's just not sustainable for households. It costs in our city, it's about $12,500 a year per household to own one car. It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the city. All of that money goes out to entities that are not part of the local economy. and it's not sustainable for the planet. Livability, because the right-of-way is not just for vehicles, it's the fabric of our cities. And lastly, for our own agency, excellence. Right? We have to do things, and we are proud of the work we do, and we must celebrate it, and we have to push ourselves to do better, even better. I lead the transformation work in our agency, and we're trying to build a culture of innovation by building a culture of asking, can we do this better? There are 4 other information imperatives that we come up with because nothing in the game currently answers these. One is transportation information should help us as a city and you as an individual contribute to accelerating decarbonization. Right? It should advance equity, mitigate and correct injustice. It should protect privacy because our travels through the city are so unique that I could sell you a cup of coffee because I know you're in that spot of town at that particular time every day. And then I can sell it to somebody else. And so we have to protect privacy. And lastly, we have to level the playing field because these big private providers are trying to span the whole value chain and monopolize it. And that's great if it's better service. It's terrible if the next day they lose $5 billion and they go out of business, right? And then we're left holding the bag. And so those are let me go back to my takeaways. If you want wholesale, wide-scale change, you have to change systems. Think about information, how it flows, and what's getting built on it. Most of that is hidden. Tech innovation requires institutional innovation, which means how are your institutions changing to adapt to that? And then focus on the users and build on values. And maybe the next set of transportation information, the infrastructure we're building, will work more for all of us and work for our cities. Thank you.
So just to give you a little lay of the land, at the end of all of this, we'll have a chance for Q&A with all of our panelists. We just did Mary's questions earlier because she had to leave, but I know we're all keen to ask questions of Benji and the others. So next up, we have Michael Byrne. And Michael is the president of MGB Consulting. He is an award-winning New York and Berkeley, California-based retail planning and real estate consultancy hired by a wide range of private, public, and quasi-public nonprofit sector clients across Canada, the US, and the UK to undertake market analysis, devise tenanting strategies, and spearhead implementation efforts. So he is well versed in the specifics and nuances of the Canadian retail landscape and has worked extensively across the country with past and present consulting assignments. Downtown Toronto, downtown Kitchener, downtown Winnipeg, Saskatoon, and downtown Dartmouth, among others. So we are thrilled to have Michael, and he's up next.
Good morning. There we are. Okay. Sorry about those brief technical difficulties. One of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain, who said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." And it seems like an apt introduction to today's topic, the retail apocalypse. Another case where we think we know something, but actually we don't really. And the result is the very thing that we mistakenly think is already happening, the old self-fulfilling prophecy. We think that brick and mortar is dead, and so we act in ways, we invest in ways, we run our businesses in ways that effectively make sure that that will happen. We were all familiar at this point, I imagine, with the narrative. One retailer after another declaring bankruptcy, closing stores, in some cases liquidating entirely, an ever-growing number of regional shopping centers going dark and turning into ruin porn on websites like deadmalls.com, Amazon's market share rising, its ambitions growing, its path to world domination assuming an aura of invincibility. Story upon story bombarding us with this narrative of retail apocalypse. A steady drumbeat from journalists in the mainstream press, from investors in the stock market, from the man on the street. And indeed, there have been a number of casualties. This list offers up some of the most well-known names that are no longer with us. And then there are the countless numbers of independently owned and operated retailers on Main Street that have given up the ghost as well. That's what we've been hearing. But it does not align neatly with the Canadian experience. Most of these high-profile liquidations are U.S.-based retailers. And even some of the banners getting retired or downsized in this country can be attributed to strategic decision-making by U.S.-based parent companies. Lowe's buying Rona Home Improvement, then closing a bunch of redundant locations here. Home Outfitters, done in as its New York City-based private equity owner, chooses to refocus on its two core assets, Saks Fifth Avenue and the Bay. And on the real estate side, regional shopping centers have retained more of their stability here, with sales per square foot, a key metric, increasing in almost all major Canadian malls in 2018. Partly this is a simple matter of supply and demand. The U.S. leads the industrialized world with some 24 square feet of retail space per capita, 50% more than Canada, the distant number two. Less inventory of retail space means that Canada cannot fall quite as hard. Its vacancy rates will not drop as much. Its sales per square foot will remain relatively high. Indeed, many of the big and medium box retail categories in which the U.S. lost large chains were ones with 2 or 3 main competitors that have shrunk now to 1. Canada's always been more in the 1 or 2 major competitors. And there's still been room for smaller formats here in Canada, which were long ago pushed aside in the U.S., like Kohl's and Sunrise Records. Indeed, with some U.S.-based retailers that had lost their way stateside, their Canadian divisions have been doing quite well, perhaps the best example being Toys R Us, which closed all of its stores in the U.S. last year, but has remained profitable for the last decade in Canada. So its 82 stores here were sold in bankruptcy to a Toronto-based holding company, which plans on not just keeping them open, but also expanding the number of locations. Similarly, Claire's Accessories, the U.S.-based tween and teen-oriented accessories chain, did not include Canadian operations in its recent bankruptcy filing and store closure plans. In fact, a number of Canadian brands have proved so popular that they have started to aggressively expand in the U.S., if not globally. Of course, there's the Lululemon juggernaut, but also Respect Your Universe, Aritzia, Arc'teryx, Canada Goose. All of these have been growing their store bases in the U.S. and elsewhere. Some are even acquiring struggling brands in other countries. Sunrise Records, which just was a few years removed from having converted 70 Canadian HMV stores, just rescued Britain's HMV from bankruptcy and plans to keep most of its 127 locations open. Same with YM Inc., which owns a number of Canadian brands you see in the malls, just bought Charlotte Russe out of bankruptcy in the U.S. Finally, Canada retains its appeal among international brands, with 50 new ones having arrived in 2018, followed by another 50 new ones in 2017, followed by another 30 in 2018, including U.S.-based Red Wing Shoes, Japan's Uniqlo, Decathlon from France, and Britain's Mountain Warehouse. So let's go to the elephant in the room, e-commerce. Yes, its market share has continued to grow at the expense of brick and mortar, and it is forcing retailers to recalibrate how many physical stores they actually need as complements to their digital presence in an omni-channel world. And yes, this has obviously dampened tenant demand for ground floor retail space and caused a great deal of hand-wringing among property owners, leasing professionals, and other downtown stakeholders. But let's do some unpacking of these numbers. The percentage that you've probably read in the newspaper is that e-commerce accounts for roughly 9% of retail market share. But this is actually not the right number, for it includes a bunch of line items that really do not belong there. Like international sales, when a U.S. consumer buys something online from a Canadian retailer, for instance. Like click and collect sales, that is, goods that were ordered digitally but retrieved in store. It also encompasses the fees that online shoppers pay for shipping and handling 33% of the time. And it does not subtract for online purchases that are later returned. With these and other amounts removed from the equation, one arrives at a more accurate percentage between 3 and 4%. And when you just consider pure play online retailers, and not the online sales of so-called legacy retailers, that percentage drops to roughly 2% in both Canada and the U.S. Right? Now, you might say, no way, that does not pass the proverbial smell test. But consider a few things. One, you might have read that Amazon just became or is about to become the largest seller of apparel in the United States. And technically this is true, but actually its overwhelming majority of apparel sales are in basic commodities. Look at their top 5 best sellers here on Amazon.com. Socks, briefs, and t-shirts. In terms of true fashion, on the other hand, it is still a ways away from becoming a serious threat. Its private label brands have not yet resonated. Designers are very reluctant to sell on its platform. And speaking more generally, most fashion shoppers prefer to see, touch, and feel before buying them. Finally, and this might be the most important point, e-commerce assumes that we only shopped in the past because we had to. And now, freed of the need to leave the comfort of our couches, we will just stop visiting physical stores. And instead do what exactly? Right? We forget that shopping, along all the other things that digital is supposed to free us from doing, are the stuff of life. And believe it or not, many of us like doing it. Right? Indeed, I do not think it's a coincidence that the original e-commerce pioneers were almost exclusively men. A gender not known for shopping as a leisure activity. The e-commerce hysteria, it also extends to the tenant side. The reality, which remains a secret among most of the general public, is that pure play online retailing is a huge margin buster. Given the high costs of customer acquisition, which grow over time as the pool of early adopters is exhausted, given the high costs of shipping, which, as you can see from this slide, continue to increase even for Amazon at its scale, and given the high costs of product returns, which are 3.5 times more common with online purchases than brick and mortar ones. It's just one big money pit. And absent any future game-changing developments, like drones, for instance, I would argue that e-commerce on its own is simply not sustainable, which is precisely why we are now seeing the rise of clicks to bricks. That is, digitally native retailers are starting to build networks of physical stores because they see them as essential to reducing the costs and giving the omni-channel model a fighting chance, right? Countless of these retailers, including many who said they would never open physical stores, have suddenly started to proliferate across the U.S. and increasingly Canada. Warby Parker, Athleta, Bonobos, Indochino, a Canadian brand, Untuckit, Casper Mattress, Everlane, Allbirds, Frank & Oak, Oakenford, I mentioned Indochino, 2 more Canadian brands, right? Indeed, that's even what Amazon has been doing, right? First with its Amazon bookstores, then with its Whole Foods acquisition, its Amazon Go convenience stores, its Amazon 4-star locations, and its most recent announcement of a new traditional mid-market grocery banner. Sorry about this. There's a lot of notes with this presentation. So, who is most impacted by all of this? All right? Yes, there have been retailers that have closed from e-commerce. First, there were the category killers, which you would think of as the big box retailers that fill power centers, right? These are the retailers like Linens and Things, Sports Authority, Future Shop, all of which are no longer with us, right? And the reason is because what they primarily traded on were 2 things that the internet can do better: selection and convenience. Right? Now, more recently, what's been feeling the effects more is department stores and specialty apparel. In fact, department stores and specialty apparel account for the lion's share of store closings in the last 3 years, specifically the multi-brand retailers, like a department store, where you sell many brands that are not your own and that can easily be found elsewhere. Right? Those are the retailers, whether they're department stores, whether they're boutiques that look like this, those are the retailers that have been most vulnerable. However, it's important to note that once you remove department stores and specialty apparel, all other segments of retail have actually been increasing in huge numbers. As you see in that slide, we've lost almost 10,000 stores and soft goods and department stores, and we've gained more than 18,000 in all other segments, right? As of this year, 75% of the store closures are just from 20 retailers, right? And even in fashion, there are losers, but there have been winners, literally, right? Off-price fashion continues to expand aggressively, both in the U.S. and in this country. They offer a treasure hunt atmosphere which is not easily replicated online. Cosmetics and skincare have also continued to grow amidst e-commerce's rise, largely because of the see, touch, and feel aspect. And activewear, athleisure, active lifestyle retail, there seems to be no end to this category. Of course, Canada can be blamed for starting it all, although we could pin that on Vancouver, I suppose. Although even Lululemon has gone far beyond their original focus on yoga wear. So this is another area where stores continue to increase in number. Okay. For the retailers that have failed, what is going on? Well, while it's usually the culprit is considered to be e-commerce, and obviously that does have some effect, there are many other factors, often of their own doing, which account for their demise. Some of these retailers, Sears being perhaps the most notable example, have been struggling for a long time. And frankly, they've been able to sell online too. There's no reason why Sears couldn't have become a much stronger online player, but they didn't, right? So these are not surprises and would have happened in any event. Overexpansion. Right? Forever 21, you might have heard the rumor that they are about to declare bankruptcy. They did earlier this year close their flagship store at Yonge and Dundas in downtown Toronto. Very much a case of overexpansion. They are in so many different countries, and in the U.S. they've been taking all of these large department store spaces. That's a lot of square footage, right? It was just too much square footage. Other reasons, brick and mortar competition. When you hear about department stores that are struggling, often, again, e-commerce is the first reason that's given. However, my contention is that department stores have been more done in by by the increase in off-price retailing that I mentioned earlier, right? By the spread of outlet malls across Canada in recent years, right? All of that has created brick and mortar competition for department stores that they have yet to figure out how to address. Next, crippling debt burdens. This is the most under-narrated part of all this, right? Most of the retailers that have gone bankrupt, it's been a common story, right? They were bought by a private equity firm in the 2000s with a lot of borrowed money, right? And then they had to pay back the borrowed money, right? While at the same time making investments in digital, in physical stores. Well, when a loan comes due, what gets priority? The loan, right? So those investments were never made, right? And eventually, they have to declare bankruptcy to protect themselves from their creditors, right? All the while, they haven't been updating either their digital presence or their store fleet, right? That's almost every bankruptcy in the United States can be explained in those terms, right? J. Crew, which has closed a number of stores across Canada. Again, the victim of a leveraged buyout. Okay, so finally I want to get to a little bit of the local context. Atlantic Canada, first I'll start with the malls. Just one of the top 30 malls is in Atlantic Canada. just one of the top 30 malls in Canada, is in Atlantic Canada. That's Halifax Shopping Center. And overall, $570 per square foot in sales, which is the lowest of 6 Canadian regions. But the Class A properties in Atlantic Canada have been holding steady, as you can see. Halifax Shopping Center, Avalon Mall, Micmac Mall, Champlain Place, Moncton. It's the second-tier centers that are in trouble, right? Furthermore, a bunch of brands have been expanding here, right? They have been discovering Atlantic Canada. And we wonder if some of these clicks to bricks retailers, which have so far focused primarily on the Torontos and the Vancouvers of the world, will start to find Atlantic Canada soon as well. A real question in retail is, to what extent will they grow to the same scale as the legacy retailers once did, right? Will Indochino ultimately need as many stores as Brooks Brothers, right? Will they ever get to secondary and tertiary markets? Or will they stay focused on Toronto and Vancouver? That's a big question. What about downtown? Well, downtown's actually, there's been continued vitality. It's been the strongest it's been in a half century. In fact, downtown is to some degree becoming a victim of its own success, right? With escalating rents resulting from new construction, escalating retail rents, and with shopping centers increasingly looking to co-opt the model, right? You're hearing about malls trying to become community hubs, trying to poach the best independent merchants from main streets, right? These are all problems of success, right? And we should make sure to remember that, because 30 years ago, especially in the U.S., it was a very different story. And downtown is well positioned to deal with the e-commerce threat because it works to its inherent advantages. In certain ways, downtowns have had a good 60-year head start on shopping centers, right? We've been forced to adapt to changing realities in the marketplace much earlier, right? And as a result, we've perfected a formula, as evidenced by the maturity I just mentioned, right? And this involves growing and serving captive submarkets, residents, workers, tourists, students. I want to point out tourists in particular, because tourists are often in a very different mental space as other consumers, right? More prone to impulse shopping, right? Captive submarkets, they're not going anywhere else, right? Placemaking and texture, which is what this whole conference is about. And finally, leading not with mass market retail, but with food, beverage, and entertainment. And yes, boutiques in a supporting role, right? No, we're no longer going to be the primary shopping destination of our respective regions. That day has come and gone. However, that does not mean that shopping does not play a role, and that successful downtowns can't have a number of boutiques, right, that complement the food, drink, and entertainment focus. It's just that there's little margin for error there. Boutiques already operate on very low margins, right? Now they're paying higher rents, right, higher overhead, right? And just a little hit from e-commerce can make the difference between a profitable year and a down year, right? So the ones that seem to survive, they also follow a similar formula. They offer, again, unique brands, products, and/or atmosphere that cannot be found easily elsewhere. Ideally, they're vertically integrated, right? Service and loyalty emphasis, you've been hearing that for years. Other revenue sources, whether it's also online, whether it's events and fairs, whether it's even subletting portions of their space, right? Other revenue sources, right? And finally, real estate solutions. This is an interesting area of experimentation. You have a lot more co-location of retailers, entrepreneurs who basically locate in the same physical space and share in the pain of the rent, or they find second-tier spaces, whether it's kind of a slightly below-grade space that retains street-level visibility, or on a secondary side street like a Dresden Row, right? Or early going, when their area is still up and coming, they take advantage of programs to try to buy their buildings. So these are some of the ways in which they are not just fully or even largely dependent on their walk-in trade. So as you can see, I'm an optimistic sort. I don't believe that the sky is falling when it comes to retail, as is often implied. I'm optimistic about brick and mortar retail. I'm optimistic about downtowns. Brick and mortar is not dying. Yes, things do hang in the balance, But let's not inadvertently tip the scales towards what we fear, right? Let's not give our merchants, our investors, or our landlords reasons to give up on retail. Because then they will, and then we really will be in trouble. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Fascinating. Okay, so we're just going to quickly, it's really important that we acknowledge the wonderful sponsors who support this event and enable us to host all these amazing presenters from out of town. That's the reason we're able to do that, because we have people step up. So I just want to acknowledge our sponsors, and we're going to put them up on the screen as well. So we have, our partners include Develop Nova Scotia, and it's a long list, but they need to be acknowledged. Downtown Halifax Business Commission, National Public Relations, RAD Consulting, Marriott Halifax Harbourfront, Southwest Properties, Halifax Partnership, Halifax Stanford International Airport, Nova Scotia Department of Business, Nova Scotia Department of Energy, Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, Davis Pier, Port of Halifax, Dalhousie University Faculty of Architecture, Killam Apartment REIT, Dexel, Urban Capital, FBM Breakhouse, Keith's Brewery, Atlantic Developments, Cox & Palmer, Turner, Drake & Partners, Halifax Public Libraries, MP Andy Fillmore, the Rick Hansen Foundation, North End Business Association, Spring Garden Road Business Association, Quimple Road Business Association, and Downtown Dartmouth Business Association Commission, and Halifax City Councillors Lorelei Nichols, Sam Austin, Way Mason, Sean Cleary, Russell Walker, Stephen Adams, Richard Zerowski, and Tim Outhit. So thank you, everyone. I'm now going to call, yes, thank you. We are so appreciative. So now I will call upon Greg Woolner with CoLab. But obviously this is very fluid, so grab coffee and do whatever you need to do. You don't need my permission. All right.
Hey everyone, I'll be really quick. I know that after some really inspiring conversations and presentations from this morning, you're going to want to turn to each other and start talking about the great things that you heard. And you won't be able to talk to everyone, so we want to be capturing some of those ideas. So if you go to menti.com and enter that code just on your phone or your computer, your responses to this question will just start populating live, and we'll get a sense of what people are thinking about. And the question is, what ideas have you heard today that you want to see or make happen in Halifax? And so we'll just leave that up over the break. Feel free to contribute. Your ideas will start getting up there. Someone's already done one. So thanks a lot. We'll just keep these going throughout the breaks all day long. Thanks a lot.
Okay, everybody, if you could take your seats, we are going to resume the program shortly. Thank you. Okay, I would now like to welcome Joanne McLean, who is Director of Air Service and Airport Experience at Halifax Stanfield International Airport, who is a wonderful sponsor, and she'll take it from here.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for having us here today. And it's so far I've sat and listened to the sessions, and it's been a great morning so far. So I hope everybody else is enjoying the information that you're receiving today. It's a great pleasure to be here representing Halifax Stanfield. When I sit and listen to everything that's been talked about, and really the theme of this conference, it's quite fitting that we're here. We move about 4.3 million people through our facility every year. So when you talk about moving people, I know Mary talked about connecting. Our tagline is actually "Connecting means the world." We connect people from Halifax to locations all across the world. So it's important for us. We have the same challenges that a small city has. We have 5,000 people that work on the airport property, whether it's with the airport or with our partners. So we're really like a small town. And we do have the similar challenges in terms of how do we move people efficiently? How do we make sure that we have the right services and the right experiences for people as they go through the airport? So this has been really interesting to listen to, and I'm looking forward to the next few speakers. And including one of our strategies is to connect people from the airport and connect our great city with the airport in terms of whether it be artwork, food and beverage concepts, experiences. We promote new business out at the airport, and we're continually looking for ways to make sure that we link what we do at the airport to the city and create some synergies when we have people traveling through the airport from around the world. And one of the things that I get to do, actually, and I have the pleasure of doing, is I get to promote this fine city to airlines across the world. And one of the things that we always get is a bit of a raised eyebrow when we start talking about Halifax. Thankfully, most people know where Halifax is for the most part that we deal with, so that's a good start. But the second thing is they really do raise their eyebrow when we talk about how many people go through our airport, but in particular, we also talk about the city and how the city is growing, how progressive we have become in the last few years, and it's incredible the amount of people that are really interested in hearing our story, and they will come visit afterwards to see really what it's all about. So congratulations to everybody who's involved in making this city as great as it is today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce a couple of speakers that are going to come up and talk to you this morning. Our first speaker is Jerry Post. Jerry's the Executive Director, the Nova Scotia Accessibility Directorate, Department of Justice, Province of Nova Scotia. Jerry's a planner who has worked around the globe. He's been honored with various awards, including the World Leadership Award in Town Planning for his work in the Middle East. Jerry is an inclusion advocate whose recent work resulted in the Nova Scotia Accessibility Act. He is now Executive Director for Accessibility in Nova Scotia. He's also one of the founders of Walk and Roll Halifax. Jerry, would welcome you to the podium. And coming up with Jerry to present as well is Sarah McCarthy. She's the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives with the Rick Hansen Foundation. Sarah McCarthy is the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives, where she is responsible for leading the RHF Accessibility Certification and the Rick Hansen Foundation School Program. And I will say before I finish introducing Sarah that actually at the Halifax Stanfield we are participating in the accessibility accreditation, and we're really thrilled to be able to partner with these fine folks and make sure that we have the right services available to everyone that passes through our airport. Sarah brings national and international experience to this role, previously working for an association management consulting firm where she served as executive director of several nonprofit professional healthcare organizations. Sarah has a Master of Science in Pharmacology and Therapeutics and an MBA in Strategic Management from the University of British Columbia. And I would like to welcome Sarah to the podium as well.
Good morning, folks, and a special welcome to our visitors from outside of the Maritimes. It's a pleasure to be here. And some of you may be wondering, why is this guy in a chair? And I'll tell you, I was like most of you about 7 years ago, running around, playing tennis and swimming and biking and all that. And I was living overseas at the time, and something happened very suddenly to me that, in fact, ends up being hereditary in my family, and I rushed back to Halifax, went to emergency, and the last thing I remember was the chaplain standing over me, giving me my last rites. Luckily, I woke up, and I think I'm still here. And at that stage, I made a commitment. When I saw all the barriers in my way to make this my life, is to basically become a barrier buster for persons with disabilities. And as well, at the same time, the province made a major commitment for an Accessibility Act. We're now the third province in Canada to have such an act. In fact, the Canadian government has followed us as well. We also have a national act on accessibility. And the reason for that is because of the numbers. Is in Nova Scotia, about a third of our population has at least one form of a disability. We're the highest in Canada because we're also the oldest population in Canada. So that has significant impact. And when you have a disability like myself, I don't walk or roll alone. It impacts my family members when I go to a restaurant, my friends and others. If you just include direct family members, we're talking 560,000 Nova Scotians. So over half of our population is directly affected by persons with disabilities. But for some reason, that large minority, in fact, we are the largest minority in the province, it has not resonated with the policymakers and planners and urban designers up until just recently. And really, that's what our movement is all about, is to ensure that we design cities for all people. Another important thing is perhaps I'm a bad example to be leading this for the province. Not all disabilities are visible. Many are invisible. People who have issues with their sight, with their hearing, of course, cognitive issues. So in fact, those are most predominant within our community. So that's an important consideration to have. And as well with seniors, currently in the province, those over 65, 43% of those have at least one form of a disability. So that's a very large portion of the population. Now, we have this new Accessibility Act. We're the third province in Canada. And what the province has done, and it's quite bold, is that they've set a target for us to become accessible by 2030. Seems like a long way off, but it's not. We've had generations of neglect for persons with disabilities. The other important thing is that in the past, doing things for persons with disability has been sort of doing it as a social service, to be nice to those poor people in wheelchairs. Well, we've said to the province, listen, read your human rights legislation, not just provincially, but nationally and internationally as well with the UN, is that we have a right to have access to government services and other things. The other important thing is how we put the whole legislation together, a lot of community engagement, and that's continuing in that we now have a group of citizens that's advising the province on making things happen. 2030 is a nice thing to say, but what does it really mean? So the province, in its act, mandated itself to prepare an implementation strategy, which it has done. We call it access by design, which is really, really important. You design it in on the front end. The cost is minimal. It's the retrofits, not just for the built environment, but on policies, procedures, all those sorts of things. And as well, the government has prepared a plan. Municipal governments will play a key role, and I'll talk about that. And as Benji mentioned, and I thank you, Benji, this whole thing of we need to change systems, and standards are key to that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The Accessibility Act here, it's all about removing barriers. And it's not just physical barriers. Perhaps the biggest barrier we have is an attitudinal barrier, or it's a lack of awareness of the barriers that persons with disabilities face. So we're doing a lot of work with the schools, including universities. In fact, you know, when I went to planning school back in the early 70s, there was nothing in our curriculum about accessibility. You know, we're talking a third of the population. That is starting to happen at Dalhousie and other universities. And it's not just planning, schools of architecture, it's also IT for assistive technologies and what have you. So that's really, really important. And, you know, the curb cuts you see, what we call the curb cut effect. You know, the curb cut doesn't just help me, it helps many others in the community. So rising tide lifts all boats, and that's what a term that Rick Hansen uses an awful lot. And as you see here is all the various users that are benefiting from the curb cuts. And it's not just curb cuts. Where do you think Siri came from? The early development of Siri was for the blind, to be able to read things in and then translate it into the written words. And another interesting sort of anecdote is, did you know that the American football huddle is a curb cut effect? So what's he talking about? Well, about 100 years ago in college football, there was a college that focused on blind and deaf individuals, mostly deaf playing. And when they called the play, they huddled because of sign language. You know, if they didn't, someone could have read their play across the field. So it's sort of interesting how this curb cut effect affects everybody in this room and benefits everybody. On standards, of course, built environment, you know, we've got a pretty good building code, but that just deals with the building itself. It doesn't deal with the exterior environment out there. So we're working on a whole new standard. Education, a lot of talk about diversity in education, but not a lot of action, working on that. Delivery of goods and services. For example, websites, accessible to the blind, most are not. Moving towards that, communications, public transit and transportation, and of course, employment as well. So, and on the whole thing of standards, one of the things that has been happening in the community is the Rick Hansen Foundation has started to work on basically an international standard on the built environment. They don't like to call it a standard, but I think it's going to evolve into that, and I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to talk about that.
Okay, so I'm going to do an introduction to what we call the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification Program. We try to keep a little bit of a short term on that with RHFAC. And I'm going to start out by talking about accessibility nationally. We did a recent Angus Reid Institute study across the country in regards to how accessibility affects us. We ended up with some supporting results that says that 24% of Canadians have a mobility, vision, or hearing disability or challenge. This supports some of the StatsCan, although StatsCan comes in a little bit lower towards 20%. 47%, so you think half of the population of Canada, has a relationship with someone who has a physical disability or challenge. When we ask them about how much they actually care about access, we get some very interesting results. 2/3 are concerned about future mobility challenges, so a huge percentage. 53% want Canada-wide standards for universal access, and 70% say that new buildings should be universally accessible. And for confirmation with this room, new buildings are not universally accessible in many cities in Canada right now. Accessibility also matters in reference to money. We talked about malls a little bit this morning. 30% consider accessibility when deciding which business to visit. So 9 million adults are deciding whether or not they want to go to that restaurant, dependent on whether or not that restaurant is accessible. And then 21% would support a certified accessible business more often. So that's the program that I'm going to talk about this morning. Okay, so we created an accessibility certification program. It's a rating system that measures the accessibility of the built environment. It's based on the concept of LEED. So you think about LEED as being a consistent way to be able to rate buildings based on their greening initiatives. This is what we've done for accessibility. We've used a consistent methodology by using a national and international scale. So we've partnered with the Canadian Standards Association to use their standard in order to be able to conduct those ratings. So what can be rated? So we created the program to be able to rate the built environment, but what does the built environment actually mean? It addresses commercial, institutional, and public buildings. It also addresses multi-unit residential buildings. So we don't do single-family homes. Accessibility means something different to every person, and so being able to rate a single-family home is not as much relevant. We also rate trails and pathways. It's an interesting example when we talk about the Cogswell District here in Halifax. We're doing a lot of work on the trails and pathways at Cogswell because of the fact that that site has agreed to build to be gold. We also need to be able to determine whether or not you can get in between each of those buildings. And we can also look at final design plans. So you can get a pre-construction approval to be accessible so that that way you're actually building to accessibility as opposed to retrofitting to accessibility. So how are sites, buildings, or facilities rated? These are each of the sections of the rating system. So it covers, and anybody who is interested in having the big long textbook on this, by the way, is more than welcome. You can send me a note. So there's 400 pages on how this happens, but it's everything from vehicular access, exterior approach, interior circulation, etc. One of the important ones, of course, sanitary facilities is a huge issue for people with disabilities in built environment. And as I mentioned, trails and pathways. So how do you actually get into buildings, between buildings, and how do you use cities? Major benefits associated with the certification program are really about defining something that we can use nationally. Right now, there's lots of work being done on harmonization of standards across the country, but that hasn't been done quite yet to date. And we really need to be able to define access and what that means using that common methodology. It also provides an inventory of existing access issues. So if you have a rating conducted, you get a result that provides you with a specific understanding of each of those sections of accessibility. You can use that for planning purposes. You can use that to be able to promote how well you did. You can use it to talk to your committees. Most municipalities have accessibility committees, etc. It also creates opportunities for businesses to take advantage of a majorly underutilized workforce. So people with disabilities in Canada are extremely underemployed. It's a highly educated population, and it's an issue across the country. Lastly, it creates a pool of trained professionals that are proven proficient in developing access. So right now, as a result of lots of great engagement, we have lots of different types of groups that are making decisions about accessibility. And we really wanted to make sure that there was people who are appropriately trained to be able to conduct those ratings. Okay, so I've got a little video, hopefully. This is our Vice President of Access and Inclusion, Brad McCannell, and he's just going to talk about accessibility.
It's kind of interesting, really. Everybody agrees that we want more accessibility in the built environment, but nobody can agree on what that means. One of the things that's happening right now is facility operators will take a checklist out, and they'll go to their facility and walk into the washroom, and they look and say, well, it's got grab bars, check. It's got a power door, check. It's got lowered urinals, check. Then they'll go off and check out the elevator. And they'll say, look, it's got proper handrails, it's got raised buttons, it's got braille and tactile, it's got a light-covered floor. It's a good elevator. And they walk away thinking, this must be a pretty accessible building. But nobody checked the front door, nobody checked the reception desk. Nobody looked at the workspace to see if it was accessible for people with disabilities as employees. At the foundation, we recognize this is a giant gap. We understand that access has to be judged on the entire user experience. their whole experience throughout the building. You can have a terrifically accessible washroom, but it doesn't mean anything if it's on top of a set of stairs. At its simplest, the Rick Hansen system is a national scale where we can place the overall accessibility of a building and be recognized that that's what access actually means. The real strength of the program is it creates a consistent methodology to measure access across a broad range of environments, from commercial space to multifamily residential dwellings, park space, trails, picnic areas. All the places where we live, work, play, and learn as people with disabilities and as important members of the community. By completing this course and becoming recognized access professionals to the industry, you'll be in a unique position to literally change the built environment, to create a new level of awareness, to change attitudes. And with that attitudinal change, create an opportunity to create a barrier-free world for everyone.
So on that note, there really are quite a few accessible
Let's take a minute
washrooms.
and talk about access.
We can stop him now. He's back. There really are quite a few accessible washrooms that we find that are inaccessible to actually get to. It happens all the time. There's lots of legislation that says that you have to have an accessible washroom. It doesn't actually say where it has to be. So, but it does happen. It's pretty crazy. Relationship with CSA Group, just as background, we partnered with the Canadian Standards Association, as I said, in order to ensure that the rating system was completely professionalized. They conduct our exam for anybody who's trained in the program. They also review ratings and give final approvals on the registry. They host our RHFAC registry, and only sites that have been approved to list publicly are posted on their registry. So there's quite an extensive background to the professionalism of the program. So rating scorecard and certification levels, what actually happens when you get rated is that you get a scorecard. Based on that scorecard, you can come in as being accessibility certified gold. This is a very small percentage of the number of ratings that we're doing. We're getting kind of 4% of building stock coming in as being accessibility certified gold. Accessibility certified lines up quite nicely with national code. This is also a fairly small percentage. We're ending up with about 40% of our ratings coming in there. And then below 60% on the rating is not certified. So the majority of buildings, or the building stock in Canada right now, is coming in as not certified. The Accessibility Professional Network, Brad mentioned this a little bit, so we're working on a professional network. This is going to be all the RHFAC professionals. We want to have 200 by 2020. There's some in this room. We have a course at Nova Scotia Community College that has support from the Accessibility Directorate. That's been proceeding really well. And we've got our first annual conference this fall in Toronto. Yeah, there we go. It's going to be over at Mars, which is an interesting site in Toronto and has done a fair bit in reference to accessibility and inclusion. And the conference is going to be able to provide that platform for professionals to discuss accessibility in Canada. There's the Accessibility Assessor training courses. As I mentioned, we have one in Nova Scotia at Nova Scotia Community College. We also have them across the country. So we have courses at Carleton University, at George Brown College, at SAIT, Southern Alberta Institute of Technology, and out in Vancouver at Vancouver Community College. We've also partnered with Athabasca, so I'm expecting an online course by early next year, which will be great, especially for working professionals to be able to take the course from home. RHFAC professionals, like I said, some of these are here in Halifax and here in the room. We've got 45 designated RHFAC professionals across the country and more than 200 who have completed the Accessibility Assessor training. If you complete the training, the good news is that you can use that for your professional development. It doesn't mean necessarily that you have to become a professional to conduct ratings. It's just a really good way to make sure that when you're making decisions about the built environment that you're paying attention to accessibility. Current stats. So we've done 1,200 sites across the country, some of which are here. And Jerry's going to note which ones are here. And so 1,200 sites to date, 718 are coming in as certified and 41 gold certified. A lot of that's been done with government support. We do have government support, of course, here. We have government support in British Columbia and most recently in Ontario. Last up, I'm just going to mention our Everyone Everywhere campaign. We just launched this last week. It's a campaign that we are launching nationally and that you're hopefully going to see a lot about on your media here in Halifax. And it's really that concept of being able to support our built environment, to support everybody to use them. So I'll go with one quick last video and then I'll hand it back to Jerry.
It's pretty simple, actually. Whether on a street, or a boulevard, or a secret path, a trail, or some sorry excuse for a dirt road. If you're on a train, tram, ship, boat, plane, a ferry, or a merry-go-round. If you're at an office, a school, or a playground. If you're at the beach, the bar, a party, or gallery. At a one-star restaurant, or a two-star motel. Upstairs, downstairs, basement, or bathroom. If you're blind, if you're deaf, if you're tall, small, or tiny. If you've got 2 legs, 1 leg, no legs, or you're all legs. Whether you're a senior, have quadriplegia, or you're a Paralympian. If you've got a cane or crutches, walker, or wheelchair. It's time to build a world where everyone can go everywhere.
Hand it off to Jerry, maybe. Or we'll watch it again. There we go. Okay. To talk about how it's happening here in Halifax.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And in many ways, for a small province, we're leading the way in people being involved in this program. We have over 60 people who've been trained. You got 15 people who are certified, including DJ. Or TJ, and various organizations are using this new standard to do audits of their buildings. And there's very generous support available from the province. Some very significant things, for example, and I have to thank the mayor and city council. The entire Cogswell redevelopment district has been designated as a Rick Hansen Gold Zone. So anything going in there has to be designed to that highest standard. And in fact, now in Nova Scotia, we have our first gold certified facility, which is the airport. So congratulations for that. And there'll be a more formal announcement later on. But it's wonderful to see that whole access by design taking place. On the mobility side, I think there's a lot of work that we can do on that by integrating things more. And I have to compliment here CarShare Atlantic and Pam Cooley in particular, for leading the way, not just in Nova Scotia, but in Canada. We have the first fully accessible car share service in Canada here. So thank you, Pam, for that. And again, that was a partnership with this not-for-profit or that's for-profit social enterprise. The library here, in fact, they're nested in the library downstairs, and the province in making all of that happen. And another important thing about accessibility, it's not just about the built environment, it's also maintaining it, and all the difficulties that we've had over the years on snow clearance and the challenges that faces. Local level, we've been partnering with the Federation of Municipalities in Nova Scotia and been very successful. Wolfville was selected as the first demonstration to put together an accessibility plan. One of the reasons we selected Wolfville, interestingly enough, at least from my perspective, is when I looked around the province, it's a very vibrant, small community that's manageable. And as well, perhaps most importantly, is that most of their town council are women. And when you go to any gathering dealing with persons with disability, I'd say 80% of the participants are women, unfortunately. So I have to thank, and Mercedes Bain is here, one of the city councilors, town councilors. Thank you, Mercedes, for making that happen. And what they've done is some really innovative stuff to encourage this thing to happen, is that all new municipal buildings will hopefully be Rick Hansen Gold. It's a policy. They're considering bonus zoning to private developers. So if you go to gold, you'll get additional density. Also fast-track developments. So if you're a Rick Hansen Gold Zone, you're going to jump to queue on getting the approvals. And as well, deduct the certification costs from any permitting fees that are there. So very innovative ways of making it happen. And I'll leave you with this quote here, you know, like diversity is a fact, but inclusion is an act. And this is where the Accessibility Act, where the Halifax and the Wolfville's, and you as community participants can play a major role in helping our community participate in all the things that are out there. And I thank you very much for that.
Great. Thanks so much to Jerry and Sarah. That was fantastic, and a little surprise for me too. So that was nice to hear for the airport, and I'll take that back, but I won't make it too public until the announcement comes out. Our next guest, I have the pleasure of introducing Timothy Papandreou. I hope I said that right. Founder and CEO, Emerging Transport Advisors. Timothy is the founder and CEO of Emerging Transport Advisors, providing strategic guidance to companies, investors, startups, and governments on the active, shared, electric, connected, and automated transport transition. As the former strategic partnerships manager at Google X and Waymo, he collaborated with teams to prepare the commercialization of the company and set up first-in-kind partnerships to launch the world's first fully self-driving ride-hail service in Phoenix, while being fully immersed in automation technology and its implications for the broader society. He co-founded City Innovate, a smart city platform matching governments, companies, and startups to accelerate innovation through the STIR Startup in Residence program. As Chief Innovation Officer for San Francisco's Transportation Agency, Timothy led cross-functional teams to deliver high-profile initiatives, including the U.S. Smart City Challenge, pioneering the shared, electric, connected, and automated vision, raising over $200 million in technology sector support. The strategic work plan, which met its 50% sustainable mode share goals 3 years early, launched major multi-module shared mobility and mixed-use redevelopment public-private partnerships projects and the mayor's Vision Zero traffic safety program. His unique insights and thought leadership draw from his varied experience and strong track record to join the dots, lead teams, build partnerships, and deliver innovation. It's my pleasure to ask Timothy to come to the podium.
Sometimes I hear that introduction thing. Is that really me? Okay. It's an absolute pleasure to be here again in Halifax. Last time I came was 2012, thanks to Pam Cooley's invitation, and got to meet the City Council. A very different Halifax in 2012 to now, not just what's happening on the streets, but I came when it was minus 18 degrees. I was actually entertained by skating on the Commons in the afternoon and got to understand what a wind chill factor actually feels like. From a guy from California, and I intellectualized what minus 18 degrees was, but it wasn't until your fabulous airport doors opened and it just went like that. So ever since then, when it's like 5 degrees in San Francisco, I'm like, piece of cake. Let's get out the t-shirt, no problem. Okay, so we have a limited amount of time. I've got a lot of things to cover for you. We've had incredible speakers today giving you some very big picture, high-level things. I'm going to bring it down to the ground and do some practitioner-type stuff to tell you how to get things done. And we hear a lot of things and a lot of reasons why things can't get done, but they're excuses. And most of it is because they don't want to do it, okay? So you have to be the tenacious people in your community to want to get things done. So let's go from there. First of all, who's been to San Francisco? Show of hands. Oh my God, everybody. Okay, great. Great city. We love your tourism. Please come and please don't stay and then go. We love the sales tax, but we don't want to do with everything else that comes with it. The problem is that everybody comes to San Francisco, doesn't leave, and our city is growing tremendously. And some really good things happening in San Francisco, but some very tough things as well, which I'll touch upon. Big trends that are happening, not just in San Francisco, but all over the world, are these 3 big converging trends. You're going to hear them over and over again. But this idea that things are becoming much more shared, the idea that I have to own everything myself is starting to fade away. What's becoming much more popular is that I can share things, I can share experiences, I can have that thing in my hand, and then I can give it back. And it's a big change, not just demographically, but in terms of our overall concept of things and stuff. Electrification, whether it's just decarbonization or electrification, is a really big change as well. The number one difference is combustion engine vehicles have 2,000 plus parts. Electric transportation has about 20 parts. It's just a simpler, easier, more efficient thing to do. And finally, we're getting ourselves into that space. And automation, with all of the things that it has, all its promises, all of its risks, it's all starting to happen, and it will continue to grow. So, a lot of these big picture things, but let's go down to what we need to do about it. We need new types of people in our city governments that don't actually exist today. There's some remnants of it, but not really. And I was actually lucky when I was the Chief Innovation Officer to really start training new ways of doing what we're doing. We need data science. We need city scientists. They don't exist. Some know how to use Twitter a little bit or Facebook, and they know how to play with some data, but cities have reams of data, and they're not utilizing them properly. So we need city scientists that understand how to use data. We need urban psychologists, people who understand. Anyone gone to couples counseling? We need those people, but for cities. We have opponents and proponents. I hear you, therefore, however, right? We need those kinds of urban psychologists to actually learn how to talk, how to bring people together, how to facilitate those really tough discussions. These are all need to be in university, and they're not being taught right now. So I had the privilege of meeting with some of the Dalhousie crew and said, these are the areas we need training on because there's a big gaps all over the world. And the third person is the storyteller. We are asking you to change. And what's the one thing we love not to do is change. We say that's for the other person. I support bus lanes so that the other person can take transit so I can still drive, right? So we have to tell compelling stories. And these three people, I've put them as women because we need more women in these roles, right? We need women scientists. We need women urban psychologists. We need women storytellers. We need all these positions. And half the population is women, folks. We don't need all these white guys anymore. So white guys, time to give it over to the women. We need to move on, okay? So one thing I always talk about when we have these panels is, are they male, are they pale, and are they stale, you know? And we need to move on. So one thing to move on. Okay, so this is what I like to do, and this is why I was the Chief Innovation Officer. You've seen this diagram before, but this is what we used to do at SFMTA. We dream big, know how to have fun, and get shit done, right? And that's the people who I work with. Everybody else, you need to look for another job. So really important to think big, feel less, open up, say yes more than you say no, make stuff happen. Just start something. Start small, bet small, and then go big. Without that trajectory, it's really hard to get things done because you get stuck in the minutia. Okay. So this is what we taught our team this over and over again when we inherited this team. The most dangerous phrase in our work language is that we've always done it this way. Who's heard of this 100 times, right? Well, it's time to change. So let's move on. Let's zoom down to California. So those of you who don't know about California, we're the left coast, we're the People's Republic of California. We are very different from everybody else. We're kind of the Quebec of the US, kind of like we're like separate but equal kind of thing, but better. You know, we're 40 million people, 400,000, we're 40 million people. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. We're slowly becoming the 4th largest economy in the world. If we were our own country, we'd just be a real force. Maybe we should be our own country. There's a big debate about that right now. The rest of the country is kind of doing their thing. We're saying we kind of disagree, so we're kind of doing our own thing. San Francisco, 8 million people. The city of San Francisco is like the thumb in your hand here. It's about 1 million people and a whole bunch of stuff happening there. This was supposed to be the other way around, so I'll just pretend we're going the other way. So we had this waterfront, couldn't use it, terrible, double-decker freeway, 60s planning, the worst things you could ever do. We did all of them in San Francisco, and then Mother Nature, the ultimate urban planner, said, this sucks, knocked it down. And we had a debate for 10 years, like, what should we do? We said, let's get rid of it. What's the world doing? We're making places for people, and goes backwards, that's what we created. So we took down a double-decker freeway that was federal, state, and locally, all these issues. We redesigned the street for people. We created a huge open waterfront. It's completely transformed San Francisco. Anybody who goes there now could not even imagine our waterfront completely closed off by a double-decker freeway. Our cousins to the north are tearing down their viaducts. Everybody's realizing this is the wrong way to do things. No more planning for cars. Focus on planning for people. We had to also merge our teams. When I joined the team in San Francisco, I noticed we had planners who hated engineers, who hated transit planners, who hated bike stuff and walk. And it's like, you know what? We're all plan engineers. This is our title now. We're all work together. And we had advocates who hated our guts and said that we don't do enough. And we had other proponents and opponents saying we're doing too much. So we said, okay, we're plan engineers, but we're advocrats, right? We are activist bureaucrats, and that's how we get shit done. So we walk inside, we walk outside. Many of the folks in this photo here have gone on to lead other divisions or other agencies around the world, so it was a great launching pad to designing an excellent team. We had to rediscover the idea of community collaboration. We would have these like 3 meetings and a checklist. We did our community collaboration, we're done, peace out, drop, we're done, right? No, it was terrible. So we actually started going to the community and saying, what do you want? How do you want to change? Do you want to change? What does it look like? And who do we listen to and who don't we listen to? And we not just talked about diversity and inclusion, we actually did it. Less talk, less reports, get things done, right? And so we had a lot of plans, and you guys have lots of plans too, and these plans say everything you want to hear, but they don't deliver anything on the ground because they're all stuck in the 40,000-foot space. So what we created in our team was the actual real plans. The capital plan, where does the money go? Money is where policy is. What does your capital and operating budget actually do? How do you have work plans? Our work plans for our staff said you need to also interact with different parts of the agency. So we actually forced that interaction to happen. And we had an annual report that said, how are we doing with all the stuff we're saying we're going to do? And how do we break down these 25-year plans to quarterly, half-yearly, and yearly deliverables? And are we actually doing that? Oh, and by the way, advocacy groups, this is how you hold us to account, because we need you to be out there as well at the community meetings actually saying we actually want this stuff as well. So the first thing we did, and I think Benji was really good at putting the systems change, we created an open database and invited everybody to start looking at all the different data sets we have, and we actually found out data that we didn't know we had as well. So this helped us all as a city figure out what do we actually have, what can we measure, what can we treasure. And from there we developed a really strong plan to say, this is what we think we're going to do. Based on all of the things, transportation is not a land use, but land use makes everything happen. So land use at the top, a transport department saying it's all about land use, right? Then it's all about travel demand management. Those 2 key pillars mean that now we can supply walkable streets, good transit, good bicycling, vehicle sharing and car sharing, and shuttle services. Those pieces are the underpinning of a system. But that wasn't enough, folks. We had to throw in some free kitchen knives. We had to say, we also need to measure a baseline. Where are we as a city, and where do we want to go in the next 6 years? Our baseline was we had 62% of all trips by car and 38% by non-car. We simplified it. It wasn't bikes versus transit versus walking. It was, these are the people who drive by car, this is who does not drive by car. And how do we get it to more of a 50-50 balance, because that was easy to say back then. And so we also worked with our climate action plan and said, look, if we're doing zero waste, 100% renewable energy, and carbon farming, what's the transport mode? So that was that 50 that actually got to go in there as well. And we tied our development to all of our talks. So all these land use developers who are doing these long-range development plans, we said, okay, if you do all these long-range development plans, this is the impact of the transport system. We're not going to say no, but we're coming to every one of your planning meetings and saying, this is what transport you need to mitigate the stuff that you're doing from development. And not about widening roads, about getting people to use other modes of transport to get around. And so we actually started to do things called reading the street. We started reading the street very differently. Benji talked about level of service, and this was fine for level of service. The level of service would say, get rid of the tram and the bus and make it all for cars. And we stepped back and said, wait a second, everybody is in a vehicle of some sort, whether it's their own 2 feet or in a car or a tram, and look how much space they're taking, and look who's getting priority, and look who's being valued. The good people in their cars that are taking up a whole lane of traffic measure up like 9 to 10 people, but there's 21 individuals on these little micro vehicles called bicycles, and 65 in a tram that are not even being acknowledged, right? So we reread the street and said, wait a second, let's redesign this. And we realized that congestion, which is the dumbest thing to chase for, you'll never solve for it, because congestion has nothing to do with infrastructure, parking, or cars. It's our work culture. The idea that our boss needs our butt on a seat at an office to just show up there is irrelevant these days. We can work from home, we can work from somewhere else. Those 2 peaks in our travel demand is because we need to show up somewhere and then leave from somewhere. If we can move that around a little bit, all this stuff goes away. So sometimes it's not even about infrastructure. The key we did was to look at the space allocation. We as humans take up about 1 square meter of space, depending on how much breakfast we've had, right? So it's about 1 square meter of space. If we're in a bicycle or some sort of scooter vehicle, whatever it is, it's a little less than 2 of those squares. We call these tiles in tech. 1 tile for a person, about 1.5 tiles for a micromobility vehicle. In a car, you need 8 tiles, 8 squares meters of space just to get in the car. And you need another 8 square meters to safely drive with distance around you. So we need 16 extra space to move a person in a polluting vehicle that kills people versus walking by yourself. What is wrong with this picture, right? So let's have a bit of a reality check on how we allocate space. The next time you hear, we don't have enough room for a bike lane, say, really? Let's really read the street and say, hang on a second, I object, to your projection. We also had to look at how we look at our space in terms of injuries and who's getting injured and where. So we used data for the first time to actually start mapping really hard things that we talked about but we couldn't actually visualize. So where people were getting injured was really important because it mattered where this was happening. In San Francisco, 75% of all serious injuries and fatalities are only on 13% of our streets. It's not a citywide problem. It's a very focused problem. Oh, and by the way, they happen to be overlaid over what we call communities of concern, which are generally new arrivals, people of color, or historically disadvantaged groups. So the most vulnerable are being the most exposed and being injured the most who can't afford to recover themselves. One of the biggest forms of bankruptcy is being injured and not being able to pay the bills. I mean, this is terrible stuff. So visualizing data is really important. We opened up Embarcadero to people for the first time a couple of years ago, and this became such a recurring theme that it's one of the biggest open street events in the country. Our trade associations, got to love the small business groups who say, we need the parking spot in front of our store, otherwise I'll go bankrupt. Really? Let's open that up and unplant that. We surveyed all of the users of these stores along certain corridors, this is Polk Street, and said, how do you get here and how much do you spend? People love talking about themselves, right? So they told us all these things, and we said, wow, trade association, look at this. People who come by car spend about $82 a month, pretty good, but you know the people who actually come here by foot from their local neighborhood are spending more per month? This was like revolutionary. We also had people who said, don't confuse me by the data. They're the ones who voted for Trump. So, these are the sort of things that happen. So, parklets. We focused on parklets. We're the first city in the world to really pioneer these parklets. We institutionalized this so any store could do a parklet whenever it wanted based on the framework. Again, we created the system which created the process. Some really good results, increase in bicycling and walking. We converted some spaces. People felt very safe along parklets, and it was a really great idea. We took that and turned it into a whole program called Playground and Ground Play, And we have over 75 projects across the city, whether it's making play streets, making fun, we're knitting jackets for trees, whatever it is, it's all about engaging the public and the community to basically own their neighborhood, own their street, and own their block, and to do things with that. We also started to change our maps. Mapping is a really important piece of information. Information is the new gold, as we say. So this is our transit map. People say, great, transit plan I think was amazing. 82 lines, 82 different colors. Can you read it? No. So we said, okay, let's ask the public, how do you want to actually use this map? They said, we don't understand how to use it at all. So we changed it and said, what if we actually just said red lines is less than 5 minutes, so it comes every 2 to 5 minutes all day long, and blue is 5 to 10 minutes and all day long. That's all you need to know. So really quickly it changed people's perspective on the legibility of the map, right? We also did this thing where we said, people wanted subways and everything. Everyone wants subways, and said, well, there's not much, we can't do this many subways. So we said, what can we do in 6 months and 12 months? Time-bound the discussion. They said, how about if you let us get on every door on the bus because it takes too long? 38% reduction in dwell time by allowing people to get on the bus door, any door, all the time, right? The maps became very legible. We asked people to rate their ride like a Yelp restaurant. How was your ride? We actually need to know this stuff. Do you know how many transit engineers and transit planners did not want to know whether the customers actually liked the bus or not? So we need to know that stuff so we can do better and be better, right? Imagine integrating all of these different modes into one system. Like, this is not rocket science. We have this thing called a phone. We can do it. So let's just get this stuff done. Our bike network as well, our bike engineers, who are a really opinionated group, love to say we've got the most dense bike network in the country, right? It's like, but it doesn't actually work. So we actually asked the public and said, how do you feel when you cycle on these streets? Because why aren't the numbers improving and increasing? And they noticed that it's terrible. So we created this thing called a level of traffic stress that basically graded each block of the bike network and said, LTS1, everybody feels comfortable. LTS4, no one feels comfortable. And guess what? Most of the network was LTS4. So that gave us those policy roles now to go to the policymakers and say, we need to focus on these very targeted areas to create the outcomes that we want to see. And we shared the data with the public every time we did something and said, here's the before and the after, and this is what it looks like. So next time you want to yell at City Hall, we've got data to show how we've improved it. When we did bike sharing, we actually asked the public, where should the bike share locations be? It's your neighborhoods, you know where you want it better than we do. And they got to crowdsource and show it, and we actually implemented it. We changed the streets, so we put the policy of like, look, if transit and bicycling is really the most sustainable ways to get around, let's give red carpet for transit and green carpet for bikes and call it a day and start implementing it everywhere we can. We also had to look after the drivers. We can't ignore the drivers. But we said, look, what do drivers want? They want to get to their parking spot as quickly as possible. Okay, we created an app and a service to get them there, and they could get there 30% faster, less congestion, more reducing of GHGs. So everybody wins when you do things for multiple people. Elected officials took them out on bike rides so they could get comfortable with the idea of cycling, celebrate every one of our successes. This woman on the left-hand side is now a mayor of San Francisco. I mean, because she used to ride bikes with me all the time, so it's kind of cool. Making the system available for everybody, not just the millennial, white guys. It has to be for everybody, right? And then just flipping the script. Don't have people on bicycles protecting cars from other cars. Have cars protect people cycling. They're vulnerable users, guys, not the people in 2-ton machines. And then open it to everybody, right? So this is, again, Embarcadero, open to everybody with this protected cycle track. So some data. Data is really important to tell a story. In 2004, Market Street, our busiest street, 1 bicycle for every 3 private cars. Fast forward, 4 bicycles for every 1 car because we took out the parking lane, replaced it with a protected bike lane. It's that easy, and it costs $100,000. You can't do this for less than $1 billion on transit. So this is how you get things done quickly and shift the discussion, right? Counters. Why do we have counters? Because it does 2 things. It counts the people, and it shows the people that they count, right? That they're important. Give me any naysayer and say, I'm going to put those 3,000 people back into cars. You want that? No. So let's move forward, right? Pilots, car sharing, bike sharing, scooter sharing, all the different sharing. Work with everybody because they're all part of the ecosystem. And we get results. We did all this stuff. Whole bunch of different things, lots of pilots, lots of trials, lots of tests, lots of mistakes. Let's be clear. We learned, we iterated, and we met our 2018 target 3 years early. People didn't believe this. We had to take it to UC Berkeley to do the analysis and said, yep, they're good. So work with your university so you can get the results. And then now the next generation, just to wrap up because I know I'm going over time, is now we're going full ball. Okay, we did all the low-hanging fruit. We tripped over a lot of fruit on the way there, but now we're doing the full ball. So protected cycle lanes, now we've had a bit too many deaths in the last couple of years. We've had people being killed, which has been awful. So now we've got a mandate with this new mayor, that former person that was cycling with us and learning all this stuff. She's like, I challenge the MTA to do double the capacity every year. So looking at electric bicycles, electric scooters, they're all part of the mix. We've got to add everybody in the mix. Move the cars outside of the way, allow accessible loading and unloading, allow different families to use, feel comfortable, allow people in different backgrounds and needs to feel included in the space, allow for multiple systems to happen at the same time, protected bike lane, bus boarding island, accessible loading zone, micro-mobility hub, they can all coexist, rain garden for all the greenies, we can do all this stuff together, right? It all works. Actually show people what they're supposed to do, and they'll do it. Allocate space for scooters, they won't be cluttered on the street, but you've got to show people what to do, otherwise they don't know what to do. And then this is what it looks like. So this is the bike lane network, this is the protected bicycle network, this is what it's on its way to now. So show people how we're moving, and then at the very end, these things happen organically where these new developments in the city, we actually have a $100 mobility pass that we put into policy now where every new condo unit requires a mobility pass as part of their body corporate fees, And now you get people who can actually not have to need a car because they can get around with all these other modes. And so while this new tech can be very isolating, here's the latest protest in the street, there's also some hard realities that taxis weren't really offering rides to people that were different than me. And so we have to have some of this reality check with technology. And yes, there are some issues that we need to deal with. This is typical San Francisco protesting. But there's also some good things as well. This is our first major stadium built in downtown San Francisco. No parking at all. And that screen is not the scoreboard of all the wins of the games. It's all your transport options that are available. It's right there inside the stadium and right outside the stadium. And it opened a couple of weeks ago with no traffic problems. This newspaper hates us, the MTA, when I used to be the MTA, and they said, no traffic, no problems, there's no story. So that was really cool. City Innovate, again, that focus on tech and governance. Government can be a force for good. At the end of all this, though, we need government working with the community, working with the corporations and our research institutions, because we're entering a new era of complexity that requires real collaboration. So I'll leave you at that, and thank you so much for your time.
Hi. So could we have the speakers come up and take your places on the panel?
Great. And so we're going to be moderating this panel on moving people. My name is Kelsey Lame. I'm the Sustainable Transportation Coordinator for the Ecology Action Center.
And I'm Pam Cooley, with co-founder of CarShare Atlantic and currently the Global Car Sharing Association Executive Director.
So we're going to sit amongst you as well, because that's the best way to do it. A little fanfare for a moment.
Okay. So, what we're going to do is we're going to have one question from me first, and then we're going to open it up to the audience we only have till 12 o'clock. So, and then we're going to open up to the audience for a little bit, and then we're going to end with another question from us that we have chosen. So, unless it gets asked by you. So, panelists, I'm going to just stand up here so everybody can see me. A lot of you talked about all of the great things that can occur and that need to occur. But one of the things that we're talking about is, or one of the things, and I'm sure that many of you have experienced this, in a city, as many others, there are some decision makers that are opposed to the changes that some of us have wanted and are wanting in our cities, and are described as important to building resilient cities. We hear consistently that people don't ride bicycles, they don't take the bus, they don't want to get out of their cars or give up their vehicles. How do you make the case to politicians and decision makers to embrace and engage and work with the community who wants such changes to make a better city? So anybody can start answering that, and not everybody has to answer everyone, but if you have something to say, then that's...
So in a previous life, before working for Seattle, I worked for philanthropy, and one of the most effective things we ever did was I was working with 26 cities across the U.S. We were nurturing leaders. We would take our leaders and bring them to a city with effective, active transportation and public transportation. And I distinctly remember the public works director of Detroit, before he came to our tour, which was of Copenhagen, his biggest challenge was Detroit is built for 800,000 people, they're down to 400,000, there's still 400,000 people, and his biggest challenge was Jefferson Street. They were debating whether to put a painted bike lane. He got to bike in Copenhagen. He's a big guy, he's like 6'4", and he was driving around with one of their council members who was a 4'11" woman. But they were enjoying it, and after 4 days, he comes back and said, we need to build protected bike lanes. It's the experience, which I think Tim showed with Mayor London Breed. Once you experience biking in very safe environments and you realize the power it has, both for your own mobility and for others, then the logic is, of course we have to do this, right? And plus, when you bike, you tend to smile. It brings out kind of the memories of you were a kid. The happiest commuters are commuters on the bike. The saddest, most anxious commuters, this is proven in health studies, are people who drive alone, right? So you get the leaders to experience it, then they go from, no, people don't do that, to realizing, why aren't we doing that?
Great.
I'm a little bit of the outlier here since I'm talking about retail. Although I think this comment probably holds across the board, I think so much of what we need to keep in mind is about context. Timothy was talking mostly about San Francisco, which is a city with 1 million people over 49 square miles, 20,000 people per square mile. And in retail, I always have to keep in people's minds that the things that are possible in cities of that density are not possible everywhere, right? And the struggle is that, of course, the good things that we want to encourage, they're long-term plays. Retail can't always wait that long. And so sometimes elected officials and other government staffers, they'll plan on the basis of aspiration, and with not enough of the reality in mind. And with retail, that it can't wait. Retailers need to make sales now, and pay their employees now, and pay their rent now. And so that's a tension which I'm always struggling with as a former planner, is that long-term aspiration versus short-term reality.
Thank you. Would anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
I think what we do is that we really engage with leaders as part of our leadership structure. So we have a national advisory committee. We do extensive focus group, outreach, this kind of thing. But we make sure that those leaders are at the table making the decisions as opposed to going at them later. So when we put together a program, we say, does this work for you? Do you like this? Does this work for your constituents? Does this work for, realistically, your platform? So that way we can make sure that city building and for us accessibility is built into what's rewarding for them.
Great, thank you for this comment.
Tim, did you want to talk a little bit about the barrier?
Yeah. So there's two ways to do this. There's the outside way and the inside way. And the outside way was we would talk to a local council member, which, by the way, our mayor is the mayor of the city of San Francisco, but the council is the council of the county of San Francisco. So we have a city and a county as one. And then basically 11 districts, fiefdoms, controlled by the lords. They're all nobility, and so they're the lords of the territory. So you've got to work with them. And we would hear the same objections that you've heard. Every city's got the same objections. They're just different languages and different pots of severity. We just found examples where we say no on bikes or walks. Well, who's biking and walking in your area? They need to become much more visible, and you need to bring them into the conversation. Sarah Joe over there, she's doing this. The local store owner wants to do this. They need to see examples because they're going to get pressed by their friends and colleagues and their foes about it as well. So that's the outside way of doing it. Give actual real people, real stories, real examples. That storytelling is really compelling. On the inside, that's where the barrier is the strongest. It's not the executive officer, it's the middle management in the middle, the knowers. That's who you have to work with. And frankly, when I was the chief innovation officer and we actually managed a team there, we developed what's called a barrier analysis. We looked at who are the barriers in the city system that are stopping us from doing all these good things that we want to do, and how do we get them out of the way? How do we go around them, or how do we get rid of them? Frankly, that's what you have to do. So if you don't have a barrier analysis of who's actually, when we hear the they, who's the they? Identify them, talk to them. If they're not going to reason, figure out a way to move them out of the way.
Great. So all the Canadians are going, oh.
Yeah, it's a very California way of doing stuff, sorry. But if you want to do GSD, not Global Sustainability Goals, want to get shit done, that's how you get it done. So.
And I think, Jerry, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I have a comment. I believe a lot in working with youth and kids. They are the real change agents in our community. And when it comes to biking, I grew up in Holland. I basically was born on a bike. And, we look at Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Utrecht, and all these various cities who are doing a wonderful job. But you look at, where they are and how they got there, and they have a true biking culture. Because everybody there, they're all cyclists, right? So when you're a driver, you think as a cyclist. And as well, of course, when you graduate to leadership. But going back to the kids is that I've worked at various places around the world, and I've found them to be the most effective change agents. We're doing that here in Nova Scotia as well. We have a program going called Readability. And this is about persons with disability. And I came into this library, when I first became disabled, when they opened. And I asked, what do you have? Do you have children's books on disabilities? And the librarians, well, come back, tomorrow. And I came back, and it was like a pile that high, incredible books. So we help them select, and we're targeting children 3 to 6 years old through the library system. And we hire volunteers who are disabled, reading about their disability. And the impact that is having is tremendous, So we have blind people reading in Braille, teaching about, service dog etiquette. My favorite session was with the deaf in the North End, where they had the deaf doing a story in American Sign Language and teaching the kids some sign language. And I remember there was one little boy there, the group of kids that were there, and he was just, he wouldn't sit. He was just so excited, and reminds me of myself a lot when I was that age, a little hyperactive. But anyways, a few days later, I get a call from the teacher. And she says, Jerry, you are a disruptor. This little boy went home and for 2 days did not speak, invented his own sign language.
Right.
Now, the impact that has, on his friends, his teachers, his grandparents, and what have you, this ripple effect, this guy has gotten it, right? So I think it's really important for us not to forget.
Thank you.
It's a great story. Okay.
So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take questions from the audience. Cut out your preamble. I know we love to do that, but please just cut right to the question. Pam is going to go around to somebody that has their hand up. And again, same rule. You don't all have to answer, but if there's something that really speaks to you or a point you really want to make, feel free to do that. We're going to be a bit ruthless because we don't have a ton of time, so it's not that we don't want to hear from you if we cut you off. It's just we want to get moving on to the next question. So go ahead.
Hi, Sean Gillis. Thank you so much. Wondering on if there's any specific thoughts for tougher areas, especially suburban areas. That's what I'm wondering.
So suburban areas, one of the defining features in suburban areas are suburban malls. And maybe Mike may have more to say about this. But most of those malls are struggling now. But that's land space that could be denser. And they're usually next to a very large arterial. So those are opportunities to redevelop our suburban areas, to put in more density and mixed use, and it's easier to then serve them by transit. The other side of this is that transit is often forced to serve very low density areas, and it's difficult because there's just not enough ridership, right? You need 7 dwelling units per acre to be able to serve by bus. One way that cities are exploring is to have more responsive systems that then are feeders into heavier, high-frequency networks. In Seattle, we were fortunate and unfortunate in two things. In the 90s, we developed a plan for the city that concentrated growth within the city in urban villages and urban centers, which was great. It was so successful that 87% of our growth is on 13% of the land. And so now we are able to serve those with buses and light rail with high frequencies every 10 minutes or so. The flip of that was the rest were allowed to be single-family housing only, which are harder to serve with transit and also very exclusionary, right? It became very much white neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods. And you couldn't build duplexes or triplexes or low apartments, right? But it's a chance to then rethink what we're going to do and think about density and moving forward. Cities are 30 to 80-year projects. Tactical projects show you what can be done, but the actual build-out of the infrastructure, the refresh of the housing stock, turns about 30 to 80 years. And we have to start thinking that way. Acting now, there was a Japanese politician that was asked, what do you do about corruption, and how long will it take us to eliminate corruption? He said 500 years. And then he was asked, well, is it then impossible? No, that's why we need to start now.
Okay, great. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
We do have another question from the audience.
Go for it.
Sorry. Councillor Tim Oath is here with us.
Hi, welcome back, Tim, by the way. We saw you. Nice to see you when you're not turning blue. I used to live in Vancouver and I used to live in Toronto, so I know a little bit about what you're speaking about in your settings there. But the gentleman from the talked to us about the retail environment, I think made some really good points too. We are the size of a small province. We don't have a lot of density yet, though we're working on it in our central area. Only 25% of our population, for example, lives on the peninsula. So what and we as a council have been very supportive of a protected bike lane network on the peninsula. What I'm specifically trying to find out is how, in your experience, what you've seen in your own areas, but other when you've traveled, is how have we integrated bike lanes and active transportation to the suburban nodes and connecting them. Most people would know I fought hard to try and get rail into our community. It's not coming, but we're taking another look at bus rapid transit and ferries.
Tim.
How do we connect active transportation to those? And where right now AT seems to be mainly focused on our peninsula area only, which is 25% of our population.
Okay, so the question is, how do we connect AT to
suburban area? How do you deal with
areas.
AT in suburban areas and connect it to the transportation that's going to bring people to the hospitals, to downtown,
Perfect.
etc.?
A great leading question.
Yeah, I think
Go
one
ahead.
of the things, so my previous hat before all of this, I used to work in Los Angeles, which is a very, very big county and very big distances. And we couldn't build out the bike lane network because people can't cycle 25 miles between to the next big center. So we basically had to think about integrating bikes with transit. How do you have bike transit integration? At the very low level, the double and triple bike racks on the bus to allow at least 2 or 3 bikes per bus to extend the reach. But on the flip side, rather than having these 25-mile long bike lanes, if you can do them, fantastic, but if you can't, how do you do the first 2-3 miles to the transit center so that it is bikeable and walkable to these regional transit hubs? And that creates a really good symbiotic effect where the area can actually attract people from the local area, but also can extend the reach of bicycling and extend the reach of transit. It's a nice synergistic way to do that. So working together, understanding what you have to do with as well. If you only have 30-minute bus service, that's what you have. So then what can you do with active transportation to get it to that point? The other thing as well is that one bike lane on a highway is really cost effective in terms of just, it's either your shoulder, your striping of your shoulder. If you can do it safer by having it some sort of protected in the worst pockets. But that's generally pretty low cost to deliver. It's part of the design feature of your upgrades of your roads. So again, having that in the policy, having it in the systems, and actually having it in the delivery schedule, those things will create more of that connectivity.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, in terms of more suburban and rural settings, I'm someone who lives in 2 of the densest cities in North America, right? Manhattan and San Francisco. I don't have a car. But that said, a fight I've fought many times is when I'm working in more suburban environments and we're trying to force a very urban development pattern, which is fine. It just takes a while, at least in terms of retail, for foot traffic to build. So you have these retail spaces that have no setback along an arterial road that's traveling at 70 kilometers per hour. That's not retail space that you'll find either anyone willing to lease, or if they do, they probably don't know what they're doing, and they will fail, right? 500 years time, retailers will be dead within a year, right? So retailers in that environment, they're going to want to have some parking. And that's just the reality we're dealing with right now. The question is, how do we incrementally get to that place where we have foot traffic that they're going to want to locate in front of? And again, this is a tension whenever we're trying to urbanize suburbs, is how quickly we can do that without setting the stage for a letdown when those retailers don't survive or that space stays vacant.
Great. I want to bring it back to that equity question as well. So what's the tension in terms of servicing suburbs and for people who are experiencing disabilities?
Well, in the suburbs, I think, again, coming back to this notion of standards, I think we got to up our standards on accessibility, especially in the rural areas. You know, for example, requiring sidewalks in our subdivisions. In a lot of cases, there are no sidewalks. And proper snow clearance during the winter to bus stops. You know, we have this policy in Halifax here, you know, with regards to snow clearance, where we have different levels, different tiers. And up until recently, you know, like the tier 1 roads, you know, the emergency routes, you know, 12-hour clearance. But the sidewalks were at 48 hours, right? Well, luckily they've changed that recently, so I have to compliment HRM for that. So thinking about those sorts of service standards and, of course, design standards.
Great, thank you. Okay, do we have another question from the audience?
Hi there. I guess this is kind of a retail question. When I visit other cities, larger cities, I admit, one of the things I covet most about neighborhoods is they have like small hardware stores and food shops, fresh food shops, within walking distance, really easy to get to. We don't have that in Halifax. We have a lot of retail space, ground level retail that's being built. We have big posters in the windows of what a grocery store might look like if it were ever to open there. But it's not happening. The market's not providing it. Are there things that governments or cities are doing that can kickstart that kind of, I mean, you know, why not have just like a storefront Rona where I can go get apartment stuff? How do we hasten that transformation in our retail environment in Halifax?
Great, and we have about 5 minutes left, so we're going to keep it real tight here.
She knows I'm verbose. That's an excellent question. Some of it, you know, one of the things that you can do is to keep building your density. Because the problem that you have, you know, and what Vancouver did quite well, is that it has enough people within walking distance to meet the threshold that a store like that requires, right? If you fall below that threshold, and that's why I mentioned the 20,000 people per square mile in San Francisco, when you fall below certain thresholds, then the only way people will get to you is by transit, by car. Bicycle's a little trickier because of how you convey your merchandise back home, assuming you have to do that and it's not delivered. Well, and then there's other issues. You know, what's interesting, one quick point is that retail is not just about are there enough people to support a certain store. There's also about do you have a tenant that can reach a deal with a landlord. And if those two markets aren't working together, you get situations like that, where you have what seems to be those thresholds, and yet continued vacant spaces.
Great.
And that's
Benji, did you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, the other thing that a city should do is do a survey of retail spaces. Because our building codes tend to give very large footprint retail, and these are usually the ones that are empty on new buildings. And there are not enough business that can afford that. Usually it's a chain that can afford that. If you say, what is the size of footprints that we have, and you provide more or give incentives to smaller footprints, subdividing these big units, you're also creating stepping stones for retail. I may not be able to run a 10,000 square foot restaurant with 20 tables. I want to be able to try out 3 tables or 5 tables. Am I able to do that? Right. And if you start doing that, then you have the small restaurants that can serve smaller densities. They have thin margins, but they can survive. In New York, the average new restaurant survives for about 3 years. And most of them close after a year or two. But there are enough small spaces that you can try something. So the cities that have done this well, Portland, one of them, is to say, what are the retail spaces that we have, the commercial spaces, and do they work across the whole spectrum of businesses as startups? Portland has done food trucks as an art. They circled around parking spaces and layered parking spaces with food trucks, and it's very easy to open a food truck. All it needs is that your axles need to be working. The motor doesn't have to work. And your food handlers are licensed, and anyone can open a food truck.
Fantastic. Well, can you believe it? We're already at time, but a huge round of applause for our incredible panelists and presenters. Thank you so much. There will be more time for a Q&A after the conference from 7 to 7:30 at the Brewery Market to continue these conversations. I think there's also a conversation around the climate crisis and the role that mobility has in that, but we'll save that for this evening. I just want to say you have time to grab lunch, so please go and do that. You're welcome to bring it back here to eat and continue the conversations. The next panel starts at 2:15, and we are conducting an engagement session to ask people to grab a copy of the questions by the registration desk and drop them off before the end of the day. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your comments, and thank you so much for coming to this first half of the conference.
The next session
thank you
is
again.
12:20? 12:20.
12:20. Did I say 2?
So
oh, sorry about that.
I'm sorry. So everybody, hold on. Just make sure that everybody hears us. The next session is at 12:20, sharp. So go grab something to eat and come back. Thank you.
12:20. Sorry.